Good evening all and welcome. The Mortis Media app is finally out for people on Android, and for everyone else on Apple, it will be out very soon. This is what it looks like. You can select the type of story you want, select the story itself, adjust the parameters within the app, and finally play around with the background music and sound effects. Level them, layer them, play all the sound effects you want, rain in this case, or any others that you want to throw in. You can do that. It's a lot of fun, and I would really appreciate it if you guys could download it, give me your honest feedback, and leave a review and a star rating. That's all I'm asking, and it would mean the absolute world to me. Tonight we're going to listen to how it would sound like on the app, with a selection of stories and, of course, some nice rain background to keep us busy. But for now, it's time to get comfortable. Don't forget to download and leave that review, and let the darkness take control. I do sanctuary work at festivals and burns. For those unfamiliar, sanctuary spaces are these events generally refer to encampments that are set up specifically for people who are not a medical risk or an immediate security risk, but have probably eaten way too many psychedelic drugs and need someone to keep an eye on them and be nice to them for a few hours. It may involve allowing them to talk through some difficult stuff, going to town on a coloring book, or just providing a comforting silent presence. Trip-sitting can be a thoroughly rewarding experience. The team I work with sets up a large, elegant domed tent at events that is open for anyone who needs a break from the festival environment, which can obviously be overstimulating at times. We also usually have a few smaller tents, intended for people who may need to be escalated and not too keen on being around groups. However, on the weekend in question, we grossly underestimated attendance numbers and did not bring the small tents. This will be an important detail later on. I was assigned to the late night shift, 4 a.m. to 8 a.m., on both the Friday night and Saturday night of the festival. There was a small and low-key crowd in the tent on Friday night, mainly folks just chilling and talking quietly, appreciating the music in the distance, and I took a brief note of one fellow in there who seemed ordinary enough. He wasn't speaking, and his eyes were quite enlarged, but that is not out of the ordinary for guests. He appeared content keeping to himself, so I didn't interact with him much. For some reason, I had recurring thoughts about the guy the next day. It was a small festival, and I saw him walking around a few times with those same dilated eyes and tightly clenched jaw, always by himself. Now this isn't necessarily a red flag at the time, except this happened to be a festival where a lot of people knew each other, and the telltale signs of tripping tend to wear off after about 8 hours. Each time I noticed him, I grew increasingly uneasy, but dismissed it as irrational paranoia and went about my fun. Saturday night rolls around, and I was excited to catch the set of a DJ I liked before my next sanctuary shift. As I was boogieing, I saw the bug-eyed dude about 10 feet away, staring straight ahead, with that same static expression and 1,000-yard stare. Irrational or not, I felt the need to create more distance between us and quickly moved to a different part of the crowd. No sooner had I done that and resumed my dancing, did I look to my left, and there he was, now 5 inches from my face, eyes like saucers, exclaiming, "Hi!" I was so startled that I booked it way from the stage area and thankfully bumped into a friend who helped me laugh it off. 4 a.m. rolls around, and I'm sharing this story with my co-staff, whom I consider good friends and colleagues. The person in question is called
G-Man. And not a minute after I finish recounting my "what a creeper" anecdote, a golf cart rolls up like clockwork, and out of it steps guess who, googly eyes? Normally our golf cart transport comes to us via the medics or security team, and they'll fill us in on what they can about the person who needs help. But whoever was driving this one unceremoniously dumps this weirdo into our care and speeds off into the night without another word. I silently signal that this is the guy I had been talking about, and G-Man takes charge. For reference, I'm a woman, so it would have been more appropriate for G-Man to do so even without the pre-context. Googly Eyes says he needs to use the bathroom, so G-Man escorts him to the Porta Johns, only to come back alone 10 minutes later. Turns out that googly-eyed man was making lewd comments to the women in line for the Porta Johns, and when G-Man tried to gently redirect him, he decided he was tired of male company and told him to piss off. We never force people to stay at the sanctuary, and G-Man was visibly irritated by the encounter, so it seemed for the best. Case closed. Right? We decided to check in with one of our homies in security just for due diligence, and it turns out they'd already spoken with the dude. I can't recall why, but it was for a minor infraction. The moment our conversations wrap up, two things happen at once. One, a couple of my friends arrive escorting a young, half-nude woman to the tent, so I immediately spring to action. And two, our friend Googly Eyes takes this opportunity to reappear out the darkness like damn Beetlejuice. He hasn't done anything severe enough for us to ban him from the sanctuary, since we deal with people in altered states. The threshold for bizarre behavior is very high, but as I mentioned earlier, we were also lacking from the privacy of our smaller tents. The young woman probably would have benefited from some time in one anyway, given her condition, but I particularly didn't want Googly Eyes anywhere near her. With both of them now here in the same sanctuary space, I did my best to create a physical boundary discreetly as possible. My two friends, both female, stayed with us for a little bit, while trying to make her feel at ease. She was alert, but non-verbal, and had been distressed and distorted when they found her. Googly Eyes immediately starts inching closer to us, intermittently butting into our conversation, his tense jaw stretched into an unsettling grimace. I can practically feel him eyeing all of us up, especially the girl we were trying to take care of, who was still rather exposed from the waist up. At this point, G-Man and our shift leader, who had been roaming around the grounds until then, who we'll call B-Money, and another male team member who is off shift but hanging out in the space, are there. G-Man, who has an eye on the situation, but can't do a whole lot at this point because Googly Eyes has already flared up at him, and intervening could have exasperated matters. Nevertheless, I'd had enough of him for the night, and quietly go over and tell the guys that I'm uncomfortable. B-Money is a pro at this kind of work, and immediately develops a plan. He approaches Googly Eyes and gives him a series of odd tasks. "Hey man, can you inspect this rock for me? Hi friend, can you watch this sage stick?" Googly Eyes is clearly struggling with these complicated instructions, and asks B-Money to leave him alone. B-Money says, "That's fine dude, no worries, but first, can you arrange these colored pencils?" At last, Googly Eyes gets flustered and huffs off, and every muscle in my body relaxes. We have a lovely remainder of our shift, chatting and doing art until the sun comes up. We even get our other guests to laugh a little bit, and by dawn, she is able to talk and walk back to her campsite independently. Sunday Funday on the last day of the festival is magical, but I'm wrecked by afternoon and drive home to decompress. The word on Facebook come Monday is that someone was taken into custody by local law enforcement on Sunday evening in connection with some thefts that had been taking place over the weekend. But I didn't get the full story until a couple of weeks later, when a team member of ours does a debrief. Turns out that a number of tickets had been hustled and sold at a discount to locals near the festival property, which happens to be in an area of the rural south, where you paddle extra fast if you hear banjos. In other words, some tickets wound up in the hands of folks who were not there for the music or the yoga worship. One of our team members had to run off to some Duck Dynasty extras who showed up at our sanctuary looking to get some, demanding to know where them topless women were at. If you haven't already guessed, one of those discounted ticket holders happened to be Googly Eyes, who also turned out to be the guy that got arrested for some of the robberies. Once apprehended by festival security and turned over to county police, they also discovered that he was on meth, hence the eyes and jaw, and was in possession of a handgun, presumably the whole time he was lurking in the sanctuary. Googly-eyed man, get your stuff together, and let's never meet again. For context, my dad grew up with this man called Bruce and considered him one of his best friends. Bruce was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in his late teens, and my dad, being the kind and caring soul that he is, stepped in to be his guardian. I say that lightly. I mean, he always helped Bruce out when he was going through an episode. Growing up, Bruce was always around. I saw him as another father figure in my life. He lived in a small town 2 hours away from my city, where we also had a holiday home, so he was constantly coming up to stay at ours. He was kind, calm, and patient, as well as being an amazing artist. Almost yearly, Bruce went through phases of refusing to take his medication. This then triggered an intense manic episode, some of which I have witnessed, and are frightening to see for a young child who only knew this person as quiet and calm. He would do and say things far beyond his control and couldn't quite grasp reality. And that unfortunately is where it begins. I was 12 years old when this happened, so it was around 10 years ago, but still feels fresh in my mind. Every summer, my family and I would take a trip down to our beach house, which was Bruce's town. Our little house was a one-room unit, where us kids would usually sleep in the lounge, but for Christmas, our parents brought a massive 3-person tent for us to sleep on the front lawn. So while my parents slept up in the house, we got the tent. A week before my dad had to drive back up for work, he got a strange call from Bruce, although at the time, I didn't know what it was about. I could see the concerned look on my dad's face as he told Bruce, "No, I won't do that." After further arguing, my dad hung up and murmured to my mum about something. "I'll sort it out." And my dad left. I asked what was wrong because my mum's expression turned into worry. She shrugged it off and told me not to concern myself, and that was that. Later that night, I heard from my mum talking to my auntie that Bruce was refusing to take his medication unless my dad withdrew money. From what I know, my dad's in charge of Bruce's finances and his bank account because Bruce has a meth problem. Bruce has a son who is trying to stay clean from it, and after Bruce tried and failed to get his son to buy him some meth, he turned to my dad, who also refused. I totally get it. He's an adult and can make his own choices, but my dad didn't want to enable his drug problem. My dad stepped into being a guardian of Bruce, so that's his job. This is where everything goes sour. Bruce started threatening to stop taking his medication ever again, and that he hadn't been for weeks. And then he started threatening to harm my brothers and I. He said to my parents, they trust me. It would be easy. My mum freaks out and tells him that she's calling the cops. The police arrived at his house to see the whole property was empty. He had fled and was hiding somewhere that made everyone uneasy. Nothing really happened in the next coming weeks, and it was time for my dad to drive back up to the city for work. Mum felt okay staying down with us, and of course the 3 kids were oblivious to all the commotion that was going on. So, we were too. Everything is good for the first few nights. Dad's gone, and that's when it starts going downhill. It's around 3:30 a.m. My brothers and I are sound asleep in the tent. My mum up in the house is also fast asleep when she wakes up to a booming of texts from Bruce. They're all blank, but since this is the first time hearing from Bruce since he threatened her kids, my mum is now wide awake and in full-blown panic mode. Bruce rings her and she answers. He doesn't reply, instead breathes heavily on the phone for 10 seconds before hanging up. The second time is the same. Mum asks where he is, but he hangs up on her. He rings for the 3rd time, saying, "Back deck," before hanging up. My mum hears a loud bang from the back of the house and quickly calls the police. The only way to the back of the house is by going through the front lawn, where my brothers and I were sleeping. I don't remember much, except being shaken awake by my dad's best friend, who my mum called in tears, and coming into the house to see 3 police officers standing around. My brothers and I were now wide awake because we were curious as to everything going on. And then this happened. My dad came back down for us with the news. Bruce's son had come up to him in the city to apologize and confess that he was told to come to end the life of our family in exchange for a large sum of money. My dad was in shock and rushed back down. Bruce was back in hiding again. My mum let everyone who knew him and was close to him know what happened, and if he did come to them, was to let the police know who will immediately detain him, as he was considered dangerous and mentally unstable. The crappiest thing was one of her supposedly best friends who knew him let him stay at hers instead of calling the authorities. Side note, they have only started talking again recently after my mum forgave her. As the summer started to wind down, we returned to the city to find a few terrifying things. My mum and dad came home to one of their bathroom windows smashed and dirty footprints everywhere. For some reason, nothing out of the ordinary had happened until my older brother, an avid cockatiel lover, went out to check our aviary birds to find they were all missing. Not one was there, and we assumed they must have escaped and flown away, until Dad got a nasty surprise opening our barbecue to see that all 10 of them had been cooked alive. My parents can't prove it was him, but after all that has happened in regards to Bruce, it probably was, especially after finding out what Mum's friend did. To make matters worse, our neighbor heard and saw what was going on when we were broken into, but didn't bother to ring the police or even let us and my parents know. We were furious. She made an awful excuse about being home alone and never having witnessed something like this. So, to Bruce, a man I knew was another father figure in my life. You may have bipolar disorder, and you can't help that. But after what you put my family and I through, I hope we never meet again. My apartment is haunted. I'm 20 years old and live in a fairly small apartment complex. I live here with my husband and 2-year-old daughter. We've lived here for about a year and a half, and the weird stuff started about 8 months ago. In my apartment, there are 2 bedrooms, and in my daughter's room, there is a utility closet and a regular sliding door closet. In my room, one whole wall is basically a closet with 3 sliding doors. You may be wondering why I'm explaining closets. Well, this is because that's where all the creepiness started. One huge OCD tick of mine is closing doors. I cannot stand doors being open for no reason. So every door in my home is shut almost 24/7. Or so I thought. One day while I was visiting my cousin, who lives one apartment building over from me, for an all-day occasion, my daughter was gone with family for the weekend, and my husband was at work. Some odd stuff happened. My husband made it home first, and only went in for about 5 minutes to grab something out the kitchen and bring it over to my cousin's place. He verified that I indeed had closed every door while he got home. After sitting around and chatting with my cousin for a few more hours, we went home. Walking through my front door, I felt like something was off. It was pitch black, but I chalked it up to my husband shutting off the stove light, which in itself is still odd. Stumbling for the light switch, we find one of my daughter's toys placed in front of the light switch, where in the dark you could easily trip over it. This was sign too that something was off. I knew for a fact that it hadn't been there where I'd left earlier. I brushed it off and continued on getting settled in for the night. Later, while walking down the hall, I stopped dead in my tracks, 1/3 of the way down the hall, when I saw my daughter's bedroom door slightly ajar. Had my husband been in there? I could have sworn he was in the living room the entire time. But then I heard it. The closet door, her closet door, in the pitch black of her room, had slammed open. I stood frozen for a moment before slowly peeking around the corner of her doorframe. Nothing. The door was closed, but something else catches my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I see it. A small light. A flashlight that had previously been in the bottom drawer of the kitchen. It sat in the center of my daughter's bed, with the light illuminating the corner behind her bed. I approached it slowly, and the moment my hand connected with the light, a button-operated toy began flashing behind me. You heard that right. This toy that you have to manually press buttons onto to turn on was flashing while I was cornered in my daughter's room. I felt my heart was just about to force its way up my throat. I couldn't breathe until, like a hero out of a movie, my husband walked in asking what I was doing, and I left the room quickly. A few nights later, my daughter is still out with family, and me and my husband are in bed. It's the middle of the night, and I'm having the weirdest dream. I dream that I'm lying awake in bed, and there is a dark shape in the darkest corner of my room. And it startles me awake, or so I think. I wake up in another dream with this tall, dark figure bent over my bed staring down at me. This time I'm jolted awake, and I'm trying to catch my breath. While I sit in the silent dark, my husband is sleeping, and I'm essentially alone. That's when I hear it. My closet door is shaking back and forth on the track, not like being blown by wind, but like someone is shoving it, trying to get out. At this point I'm in tears and shaking my husband awake, and the moment his eyes open it stops. I get frustrated and cry harder, because now I feel like I'm going crazy. But this entity obviously isn't done yet. Night after night of listening to toys coming on alone and closets opening and closing, does it finally happen. I have this problem with my eyes called optic neuritis, which causes me to occasionally lose my eyesight when I stress out too much. The reason I tell you this is because the night my husband finally got to see what I was talking about was the night I lost my vision for a few days. We were in bed sometime at night and it's quiet. I'm really good at detecting sound since I'm basically blind every few months or so. When I hear a familiar click, I sat straight up in bed. Our hallway light is a twist light, so to turn it on you twist a little knob at the bottom and it clicks when you twist it. At the same time, my husband jumps out of bed because he sees the hall light flash on through the crack of the door. I'm panicking, but I know that he is finally going to understand what I've been suffering through. He opens the door, and from what he told me, every door in the house was wide open. After a long night of closing doors and tear-filled apologies, we finally pass out from exhaustion. My daughter comes home and is acting strange, talking to walls, sitting in her closet, and pointing at corners. This scares me, but my husband says it's normal kid stuff. And before bed, my daughter and I are in the living room, and she's using her potty chair when she points into the kitchen and says, "Push it off." And within seconds, a glass is flung from the counter at the wall and lands upright on the floor. I'm traumatized living in my apartment. One thing more happened yesterday when me and a friend were sitting in the living room with my daughter, and she gets up and runs to the open door. I assume my husband is home because before she gets there, the doorknob starts turning like he's trying to unlock it. And the moment she unlocks it, the door starts to open but slams before she can pull it open. I'm confused at this point, and so is my friend, so I check the door and nobody is even near it. I live at the top of some stairs, so I'd hear someone running down the stairs if it was a joke. My daughter is visiting for holidays with family, and I'm alone. While I'm video chatting with my mother, she stops mid-sentence and says hi to my husband. I'm confused and think that she can see the confusion on my face because she begins to look confused as well. I remind my mother that I'm alone, and she goes pale, explaining that she had just seen the shape of a person standing in the hall behind the couch where I was sitting. Moments later, after I walk through the house with an old pocket knife in hand, I find nothing. But now my mum and I, at the same time, ask, "Is that running water?" I look around trying to find the source of the sound, checking every bathroom. Not a drip. Then the sound sounds like it's coming from the kitchen. Nothing again. Frustrated, I stomp back to the bathroom, and my skin begins to crawl. The sink is on full blast. How? Confused yet again, I walk back into the living room, phone still in hand, talking to my mother, and the wall behind me that connects the living room and my daughter's room. There's a loud bang, like someone hit the apartment wall very hard. I spent an hour waiting outside my apartment on the phone with my mum, waiting for my husband to get home and survey it further before I entered. I used to be a duty manager at a 250-bed hotel in the UK. It was built on the seafront in 1828. I would often sit with the girls on the front desk in the evenings if I wasn't busy, mostly because they were nice, and also because the place, despite being beautiful, was creepy as hell at night. The elevator would often ding, open up, and go up and down and stop by itself. It was always perfect when the engineer came to look at it though. There were often reports from guests that a dog was running in the halls, always the same description, and it would disappear. Someone came down from their room telling us a man was there, and we had to send someone up to make sure. They switched rooms. New waiting staff would often approach a woman in the dining hall, looking out to sea, for her to disappear before they got to her. Part of my job was to do the security/fire checks. I had to tour the building's dark basements with a flashlight. In the basement, there are arched rooms that were once used for storage linens, cleaning materials and foods. They looked like empty little prison cells now. Luckily, the maintenance men would escort me around most nights. It was spooky. I went to a fairly large middle school that had kids from at least 3 cities in the area all going to it. From there, I went to a small high school with maybe 300 kids in total. My high school was a highly competitive charter school located in the mountains and surrounded by several acres of woods. I met this guy, Sam, in middle school, but didn't really interact with him much. It was more of one of those friend of my friends things. Fast forward to my sophomore year of high school. Sam transfers into my high school, and my high school did some block schedules, so we had 4 classes and a sort of study hall/homeroom class in the middle of the day. Sam transferred partway through sophomore year, and I didn't know how this happened, but he ended up in 4 out of my 5 classes, counting homeroom/study hall. At this time, I had established a bit of a reputation at the school for being helpful and a good student. So when Sam transferred and seemed to be having a tough time, I was asked to take him under my wing and help him out. Boy, do I regret doing that. One of the classes we had together was a history class that I also had with one of my best friends. Despite her protests, my teacher made the 2 of us work with Sam on all our group projects. Sam was already kind of creepy with me, even though he has been at our school for less than a week. When we started working together, he would sit uncomfortably close to me, and at first he wouldn't say much, but as he got more and more courage, he began talking to me. At first, it was all normal stuff. I had an older boyfriend at the time who was in the Air Force and stationed in Japan. I know that sounds like one of those lies high school girls make up to get creepy guys to back up, but this was true. We were childhood friends and had began dating shortly before he enlisted, so I made sure Sam knew I wasn't looking for anything more than a friend. But it didn't take long before he started flirting with me. His flirting quickly escalated from compliments to asking if my boyfriend Alex was real, to trying to steal the purity ring I wore every day on my finger, and joking that one day it wouldn't be just the ring he was stealing. I was freaked out, but I figured there wasn't much he could do since we only saw each other at school, and he didn't know where I lived. Back when I was in high school, the chat that's a part of Gmail now called Google Hangouts was like the AIM messenger of the time, so everyone used it, and there were several group chats that I was a part of for my school that used personal email addresses rather than our school Gmails. Through this, Sam got my email address. He started sending me creepy, explicit emails about the things he dreamt about. I won't share the one I have saved, but they were gross, especially to a Christian virgin girl. He often had some part about me moaning how I loved him, not Alex, over and over again. Eventually it got so bad that one of my friends reported what was happening to school administration. They basically sent out an email to the entire school administration that Sam wasn't allowed to communicate with me at school. This freed me from everything but the creepy emails that came in on a weekly basis, at least until the end of the year. Junior year, Sam was keeping his distance, but we had a class together, so we had started interacting at a minimal level. I mostly just ignored him and hung out with my friends though. Senior year is when things started getting really bad again, and I didn't realize how bad they had actually been in my junior year until this point. We both took advanced martial arts as an elective class that year, which meant not only did we have to talk, we actually had to spar and train together. The worst thing about this is that my high school gym was a 3 to 5 minute walk from the rest of our campus, and you had to walk through a trail through the woods that I mentioned earlier to get back there. Sam would wait for me every morning at the top of the trail before school, and at the bottom of the trail after class, just so that he could walk with me. Although he usually walked a good 5 feet behind me and didn't talk to me. At this point, my long-distance relationship was beginning to fall apart, and Sam saw this as his opportunity. He started telling me stuff about how I was his soulmate, and I just didn't want to see it. He also told me that he had drawn some kind of rune that eternally bound our souls. Don't ask me what that means. Sam was into all sorts of Wicca, dreamwalking and other magic stuff that I wrote off as stupid jokes. As we came up on the end of our senior year, some of my teachers started asking me about essays, short stories and poems that I had written and turned in during earlier years. I eventually found out that Sam had been taking my old writing out of the trash at the end of each year when I cleaned out my locker, and thrown out all those old assignments I no longer cared about, and was turning them back in as his own work. I insisted I knew nothing about it, and my school decided to search his locker. The thing was like a crazy shrine to me. He had piles of my old homework and assignments that I had thrown out, and 4 or 5 composition notebooks that I used to keep as diaries and poetry journals that I assumed I had just lost at some point. The school assumed he was simply keeping my work in hopes of turning it back in and getting better grades so that he could actually graduate. But it felt really creepy to me. The school took all of my old work and made me take it home and suggested I not throw out assignments away at school, or I would get into trouble for letting him copy me. The thing is, the other thing they found in his locker that they didn't care about, but I did, was several word magnets that my friend and I had made to leave notes in each other's lockers. I know they were the ones out of my locker, which meant he also knew my combination. A few weeks after they raided his locker, I was getting changed back into my regular clothes after my martial arts class, and discovered that my bra and my extra workout shirt were missing from my locker. I reported it to the school, but nothing ever came of that. I'm fairly sure Sam stole them, but I've never been able to prove it. After that, he stopped talking to me for the most part. I had a new boyfriend who actually went to our school for the last 2 months of senior year, and Sam was terrified of him. The only thing that happened was that one of the composition notebooks I had, completely filled with quotes and poems, went missing, and occasionally the magnets and other things in my locker seemed to magically rearrange themselves in ways that didn't make sense. Some of my friends knew my combination, and although they swore they'd never touch my stuff, I just figured it was them trying to be funny. After graduation, I figured that I was finally free of Sam, but instead, he began to stalk me more closely. At first, it was just emails from accounts I didn't recognize, asking for things that didn't make sense. I marked these as spam and ignored them. Then he made an account under the same name of one of my former friends from high school. I thought it was actually my friend Becca emailing me, so I responded. We carried on a pretty normal email conversation for a few weeks, and then she got weird. She and I had talked about our relationship and things like that, so she knew I had a boyfriend. She started asking me to send her nudes, and insisting that if I didn't, she would hurt herself or try to end her life. She used to send me pictures of the deep cuts on her arm, or even counted the pills she took when I refused to do what she asked. Becca had told me she was living somewhere in Colorado, so I was pretty sure I couldn't call anyone and say someone I knew was threatening to do what they were doing. I'm not proud of what I did, or that I fell for Sam's games, but I did what I was told for fear of being responsible for someone's death. This went on for several months until I finally got tired of it and actually deleted my email address. Things were quiet from there as I started my first year of college. However, I soon found out from a friend of mine that Sam was attending the community college, which is within walking distance of the one I was attending. I didn't think Sam knew where I was, so I figured I'd be fine, and I was for about the first month. Sam started showing up outside my classes. At first, he would just stand there in the sea of people leaving my class until he knew I saw him. Then he would walk away. This started to really freak me out, and at the time I had no friends at the college and no boyfriend to intimidate Sam. After a few weeks, I started getting emails to my college email address. They always came from different email addresses and had no subject, and always had 4 attachments. They were always me somewhere on campus, eating, in class, heading to my car, even photos of me heading into the bathroom. I reported everything to campus police, but they told me that unless I could prove who was doing this, there wasn't much they could do about it. I established the habit of getting on and off campus as quickly as possible, and not talking or interacting with anyone. After my first semester and Christmas break, things calmed back down for a while, and I started trying to make friends, which turned out to be a big mistake. I had started working in a store in my local mall, and I hadn't heard from Sam or Becca in several months. Sam started showing up at my work that January. I worked in a home decor store, so the store had pretty narrow walkways between the displays, and it was next to impossible to notice someone coming up behind you, and the cameras in half the store were dead. At first, he would just wander around, and if I was working, he might do something like break something in my section of the store. One of my co-workers actually saw him do it a few times. I worked on a rotating schedule, so I worked different times and different days every week, so he couldn't just wait for me to show up. If he went to the store and I wasn't there, he would ask when I was working, claiming to be my boyfriend. After 2 or 3 times of my managers and co-workers asking me why my boyfriend had come in asking for my schedule, did I find out it was Sam. I explained the situation to my managers, and they let everyone know that if Sam showed up while I was working, they had to alert the manager and me, so that I could stay in the back. They were also told to tell Sam that I no longer worked there, in hopes that he would stop. It took my manager threatening to call mall security for him to finally stop coming to my work. After that, he went quiet again for almost a year, before popping up on my social media again last year. He claimed that he had changed and that he wanted a second chance. Me, being the stupid person that I am, and always wanting to give people the benefit of the doubt, and only seeing the best in people, started to rebuild a friendship with him. At this point, I was actually single, but was trying to build a friendship with this guy that I had a thing for a very long time, who is now my fiancé. It was only a week into us talking before he started being creepy again and begging for nudes and sending me messages like the emails he used to send me in high school. My now fiancé, then my best friend, although he asked me out within a few weeks of this, signed into my account on Snapchat and basically ranted at this guy telling him to leave his girlfriend alone, and the next inappropriate message he sent me would mean my boyfriend immediately blocked his account and he would never speak to me again. After that, I tried to put some distance between us, although I tried to be friendly and answer when he talked to me. After a few months of this, Becca made a reappearance. She started talking to me on Instagram as someone completely different. We spoke for a few weeks before she started sending me messages that made it clear it really was Sam. My fiancé and I have a theory that Sam decided to bring Becca back as a way to attempt to make me dependent on Sam again. She went back to her old tricks of the self-harm and the threats. Except this time, Sam used the timed photo thing on Instagram and his little sister to really add a punch to it to make me truly believe she was trying to hurt herself. I told her that I knew who she was and that she was lying. She threatened to blackmail me with old images I had sent her way back in my first year of college if I didn't send her more. Instead, I told my boyfriend, and he used his tech nerdiness to check out the metadata on her photos and discovered that they were screenshots from some other account and that this person actually lived in the same state as us. We reported Becca to both Instagram and our local police, and spoke to a lawyer friend of mine about the things she said, and then blocked both Becca and Sam. The only thing that's happened since then is that a few accounts have popped up on Facebook and Whisper using my images, both the appropriate and explicit ones, and claiming to be me. My fiancé has a search algorithm set up to find them, although as soon as one comes up, it's down before either of us get a chance to report it. It doesn't happen consistently, and entire months go by between incidences, but honestly, I wish it would just stop already. Sam, please, leave me alone, and let's never meet again. I am a woman that works night audit at a small hotel property in a small-ass town. I'm used to working alone, and it takes quite a bit to scare me or freak me out. I have dealt with domestic disturbances, hostile homeless men twice my size, and helped get rid of the prostitution problem on our property over 2 years ago. So when I say that this man really creeped me the hell out, know that it means a lot. Let's start from the beginning. What is it with this week? Every night has been some other dumpster fire for me to put out. But oh boy, does tonight's particular creeper take the cake. So I'm sitting at the desk browsing Reddit as you do, when a guest heads my way from the first floor rooms. I don't think much of it. He gets up to me and picks up a brochure from our rewards program and starts asking me about it. It's legit my job to answer these questions, so he starts his questions standing catty corner to me and ends up right in front of me. He says thanks and leaves. Was he kind of awkward? Yes, but not anything I haven't dealt with before. 5 to 10 minutes pass, and here he comes again. This time saying that a friend of his is supposed to come and collect him, and wants to know if anyone has come by asking for him. I tell him no, and that no one has been here in a while. Honestly, this was my first mistake, but hindsight and all that. He paces back and forth in the lobby for a few minutes, before asking if he can stand to the side of the front desk, almost right next to me, as something was wrong with his neck and he couldn't see out of the door properly. This was the second red flag, because there was a couch directly in front of me that had a section that if you just sat there you could face the door/parking lot. But apparently I lost my mind tonight. I reply with, "I guess," and he stands there and starts asking questions about his room, saying that he was supposed to be transferring to a suite tomorrow, and we are an all-suites property. I say I didn't know anything about that, but asked for his last name to check, but he wouldn't tell me. He kept mouthing something at me, and then whispering something just barely audible. It really seemed to me that he wanted me to lean in to hear what he was saying, but there was no way I was going to do that. By this point I was already uncomfortable and just stared at him, telling him several times that I am hard of hearing and that he will need to speak up. When that didn't work, I asked him for his room number so that I could look it up that way, and he said he couldn't remember. Okay. I asked what floor he's on. He said he didn't know. Now, I watched him come from the first floor rooms, and I knew he was staying down there. I just wasn't sure which room he was in. So now I know that for some reason he doesn't want me to know which room he's staying in. And for some reason this makes me start to feel very unsafe. He finally gives me the last name, Johnson, and I tell him we have no one here under that name. He says, "Oh, maybe it's under my boss's name, but I can't give a name for that either." He then says maybe it's under his company name, but told me he works for the highway patrol for a small mechanic shop called Joe Dirt Mechanics, and that he works general construction under a contractor whose name he doesn't know. While he tells me all this, he keeps doing that weird whisper to trying to get me to lean closer to him, but my brain is flashing red neon warning signs and screaming, "Danger, danger," as loudly as possible. So I print a random piece of paper off the computer and tell him I need to step into the back office to make some copies. He seems to take the hint and heads back down the hallway, leaving me free to freak out in the back room, but also free to grab my pepper spray. As I walk back out, I realize that instead of actually leaving, he just moved around the corner out of sight to wait for me to come back to the desk. I feel better armed with my pepper spray, and I'm ready to haul ass and lock myself in the back office if he tries anything. This time he doesn't stay long, just asks about the restaurant that he can see out the window/door. He wants to know if he would be safe walking down there by himself. I tell him it would be fine, and that I walk down there myself all the time, and have never had any problems. He angles for a ride a little bit, but I lied on this one and told him I didn't have a car. He leaves and heads down to this restaurant while I'm just glad this seems to be over. He's gone for 15 minutes when he returns carrying a cup from the restaurant, saying he didn't like the food there. I tell him that's too bad and make myself look busy with paperwork. He seems to take the hint and leaves again. By this point, every interaction with him has left me feeling more creeped out and unsafe than the last, and I start texting my husband to let him know what was going on. The next/last time I saw him last night, I heard him coming down the hall because he was on the phone, and when I looked up he was staring at me really intently, so I gathered some papers and went into the back office to avoid him. I heard him pass the desk and go out the doors, so I peeked into my manager's office to see him standing at her window, peering in trying to see me from there. I called my husband at that point and told him to get his ass up here because I couldn't do this anymore. As I'm on the phone, I get the courage to peek back around the corner to the manager's office that he was peeping into and noticed he is gone, and told my husband to be on the lookout for this guy walking outside of the hotel or between the hotel and the restaurant. I look out the window and didn't see him anywhere, but go back in hiding just in case. My husband comes flying into the parking lot and comes in to find me hiding in the back, telling me that he looked everywhere and couldn't see anyone. Within a minute, this creepy guy comes in the front door trying to talk to me over my husband, but after a very murderous look from my wonderful man, he booked it out the lobby and didn't return for the rest of the night. I had my husband stay to play security guard just in case anything came of it, but nothing did. Until the morning when the housekeeper filling in for regular breakfast attendant let me know that the same guy was around yesterday morning and was denied a room by our manager for creeping out the housekeeper. The manager even had to go with her to take out the trash because this guy was so unsettling. Apparently he came back after the manager left for the day and got a room from the one man on the front desk staff. When I was younger, my older cousin lived with us for a bit because she was having behavioral problems at home. My parents had to go at night to pick someone up from the airport, so they left my brother and I with her. My brother and I were both in bed in my room at this point, as I think it was a school night, and she was up in the other room doing homework. But she finished up, so came into our room to lay down with us. But as soon as she opened the door, our house alarm started going off. She quickly shut the door and came over to tell me to be quiet before going back to close the door since it didn't have a lock. My brother, who's a year older than me, woke up very confused, and the alarms were going off, and we were all scared out of our minds and couldn't even call for help because her phone was taken away and we were too young to have one. Our only option was the landline, the one in the kitchen and the one in my parents' bedroom. So we all get ready at the same time and run into my parents' room and lock their door. My cousin checks their bathroom and closet to make sure no one's hiding there before calling my parents to let them know what's happening. They say they're only 2 minutes away and not to worry, but let me tell you, those were the longest 2 minutes of my life. After all is said and done, we find out through the alarm company that the window in my parents' room is what tripped the alarm, and that's the room we went to. To this day, my parents are convinced she was just trying to sneak in a boyfriend or something, but I'm certain someone was trying to rob the place or worse, and got scared off by the alarm because of how completely terrified my cousin looked. At one time, my parents owned the house my brother and sister-in-law now live in as a beach house. When I stayed there alone, the weirdest things would happen, like odd noises coming from the kitchen in the middle of the night. If I was there with certain friends of mine, it would be a different story. There are 2 incidences that stick out in recent memory. The first one took place when we were sleeping on the futon in the living room, which we did because the only beds we were allowed to sleep on were extremely uncomfortable, so we just used them to hold our clothes and toiletries. I have extremely bad eyesight, so while watching TV that night I was wearing my glasses. Then when I decided to go to sleep, I took them off and set them on the arm of the futon folded up so they would be handy in the morning. Well, that turned out not to be the case. I reached over to grab them and they were gone. I wanted to be sure I wasn't jumping to any conclusions, so I started looking in all the places they could logically be, between the futon arm and mattress, under the futon and under the bookcase, in the bathroom, etc. But I couldn't find them. Annoyed but wanting to proceed with the day, I put on my contact lenses, and Tracy walks into the bedroom where we all had our stuff, and comes back saying, "You've got to see this." After I followed her in there, she lifts up one of her shirts, and lo and behold, there are my glasses underneath it, open and upside down, as though someone had been wearing them. Now keep in mind, Tracy does also wear glasses, but her prescription is widely different from mine. This means she would have noticed immediately if she had picked up mine by mistake. And even then, why would she have put them under her shirt? Neither of us ever had any history of sleepwalking, so I doubt it was something like that. Unless she confessed it herself. I refuse to entertain the notion this could have been a prank. The second incident is even more inexplicable. This time I was staying with Tracy and a guy I was dating at the time who we called Big John, since he was literally about 7 feet tall. Tracy slept on one of the 2 tiny rock-hard beds in the spare room, and John and I slept on the futon. Next morning, John and I were both awake, but not really moving or speaking yet. I felt him turn to look at the bookcase. That was about 3 feet from the futon, but he didn't move in a manner that would have allowed him to touch anything on it. After he looked away, a picture of my brother and dad fell off its shelf, where it was a couple of inches back from the edge, and fell to the floor and shattered. After my parents sold the house to my brother, his stepson would complain about things like his dresser drawers opening and shutting by themselves at night. My sister-in-law is not the type of person to allow something like that to scare her children, so she firmly told the entity that it was perfectly welcome to stay, but messing with the kids was not going to be tolerated. After that, things calmed down until they expanded the house, so my sister-in-law had to reiterate her original terms. I've been a hotel night auditor for 8.5 years without much trouble. The hotel where I work, night auditors always work alone, unless we were training someone new. We always lock our front entrance automated doors at midnight. One night around 1 a.m. a guy comes to the door. I called the entrance phone and ask how I can help him. He says that he needs to rent a room, so I buzz him in. He comes to the counter and asks the rate. When I tell him the price, he asks if he can use the restroom. He comes back and insists he needs water. I tell him where the faucet is, which is right next to the restroom that he just used. By this time, I think he's going to rob me. I feel like telling him just to rob me to get it over with, and he comes back from getting water and asks if he can use the phone. He can't work the hotel phone because you have to dial 9 for an outside line, and that confuses him. So I dial the number for him, and my hands are shaking so badly that I have to try and dial it a few times. Instead of asking him the number, I write it down, and when I finally get it right, there's no answer on the other line. Then, this guy leaves. I swear to myself that I will not open the doors for anyone else tonight. And around 4 a.m. a different guy comes to the door and asks if he can use the phone. I'm not opening it for anyone, so I ask the number, and I go to call it, and I realize it's the same number the first guy gave me. I can only see one person standing in front of all the glass doors, but I hear someone coughing, and it's not the guy I'm talking to. I know something is up, and instead of calling the number, I call the cops. 5 minutes later, 2 cop cars pull up. The first guy runs into the woods, and the second guy is still in the entrance, unable to run. The cop comes in to let me know what's going on. Earlier that night, there was a big fight at a trailer park down the road, and these guys were involved, and the police have been looking for them all night. People were hurt pretty bad because of these guys. The 2 guys had to get away and had no phone, so they were trying to make a call for a ride out of town. If they would have been upfront with me from the beginning about needing to use the phone instead of freaking me out, they might have gotten away.
When I was 13, I moved from my hometown in Tennessee to a whole new place in northern Michigan. There, I met my best friend Lena. Anyway, she's like my twin sister. That's what we call ourselves. Lena has 2 younger sisters, Katie and Marina. Lena and I had a friend called Bear. We also had a friend who I would later date named Ronnie. Ronnie and Bear knew a girl called Mandy, who is the antagonist of this story. We met Mandy in high school our freshman year. She's 17, we're 14. No big deal. Most of us hang out with older kids anyway. She was a little annoying, but we dealt with it because Bear had a crush on Mandy's older brother. So the stalking wasn't really starting at first. Mainly, she was annoying and tried to tag along with us for everything and was mostly just generally a nuisance. She had a class with Lena and most often would hang out around her before and after. Eventually, Mandy began to crave Lena's attention. She would tug on Lena's hair in class when she was talking to our other friends, be very loud and aggressive towards them when she was told to hold on, and shoved herself into Lena's personal space. She would take pictures of Bear, Ronnie, Lena and I, and anyone else who she knew, and post them all over the internet. Ronnie had explicitly stated that he didn't want pictures of himself on the web, but she posted them anyway. She went as far as to use the pictures she had taken of them without their knowledge and posted them without her consent as her Facebook profile picture. She went to Bear's apartment one day and ended up giving her a ring. Her parents got angry for I can only guess why, and Mandy decided to lie and tell them that Bear had stolen the ring from her. She then told them that Bear had lost it. This got Bear into deeper trouble with Mandy's parents, despite it not being true. They later learned it wasn't the case, as they found out Mandy was stealing money from them constantly. Mandy started getting worse and worse. I confronted her about her physical abuse towards Lena and told her to either leave her alone completely or stop being so irritating, and told her that I would personally kick her if I heard she had been physically harming her again. And for a while, it stopped. She began showing up to places we were going and forcing herself into the group. One very important example of this was a birthday party Lena had. She was turning 15, and it was a cosplay party. She showed up unannounced and uninvited to Lena's home in a Halloween costume, feigning ignorance when we told her she'd not been invited and she wasn't allowed to be at Lena's home. She showed up to Ronnie's house while he was alone, prompted me to get rather angry as she had a crush on him, and she claimed she knew I was dating him at the time. Ronnie told her to leave, and she said he didn't want anything romantic from her at all because he had a girlfriend. She didn't leave until Ronnie's mum came home and threatened to call the police. A fun tidbit about this is that Ronnie had no neighbours for miles. He lived on farmland miles outside of the nearest city. Hell, he lived miles from me, and I was at least 10 minutes from the city. She had to have intentionally showed up, and she was obviously not popping in while in the area. Things seemed to calm down once I moved again. I had long since broken things off with Ronnie, and we remained friends for a good while. I heard less and less about Mandy, until I wondered if anything had even happened. It was finally seemingly over. About a year ago, I was asked by Lena if I remembered Mandy. I told that I did, of course, and I asked why. She then dropped a bomb on me. Lena was a Christian for a while when I knew her. She'd been raised Baptist, and she and her siblings attended a youth group at the church that we had gone to, and I went with them to make them happy despite the fact I'm Jewish. We were all pretty close with the youth pastor and youth leaders, so I was surprised to hear that they'd stopped going weeks prior. You see, Mandy had been waiting every week at the youth group to see Marina, waiting to ask her out,
Mandy, who was now 20 years old, was waiting on a weekly basis to see Marina, who was 12, to ask her on a date. A 20-year-old woman was trying desperately to ask out a 12-year-old girl who wasn't really old enough to know if she even liked anyone, let alone if she was gay or bisexual. I was beyond furious. I was seeing red, then messaged Mandy as she was still in my contacts. She became immediately defensive, asking me over and over who told her and why I wanted to know. Now for the past few years I've been studying abnormal psychological forensics and criminology to prepare for college and university when I go. This defensive behavior, especially in Mandy, showed me that she was guilty. I didn't answer past, someone told me and I need to know. Shockingly, she told me the truth, said it was true, but that she was done with it now and she had a boyfriend. This made me feel physically ill. I asked how old he was and she told me he was 16. The worst part about everything is, in my eyes, trying to ask out a 12-year-old girl when she was 20. That is the absolute most sickening thing about it all, and I feel ill just remembering this. Mandy, for your own sake, let's not meet. God only knows what I'd say or do to you if I ever did. I worked the night shift at a gas station, and it was in a neighborhood that was directly across the street from an assisted housing complex for Section 8 people. So there were a lot of mentally ill people that had schizophrenia and drug problems. About 4 months into the job, I started hearing blood-curdling screams from a man yelling for something and about someone to get away and cursing a lot. Bear in mind this is all on the night shift. Then I saw him. From outside the window I saw a middle-aged man, overweight, with a scruffy beard. He was African American. Not that that has anything to do with his actions, but just so that you get a picture for this guy. He was missing teeth, and he'd be screaming at all hours of the night, and we closed for a few hours between 3 and 5 a.m. to clean, and he'd come into the store at 2:50 on the dot, right before I was allowed to close the doors. He would mumble to himself and say things like, "No, we don't need that," and, "Well, we don't have enough money." I just thought he was nuts. He would also ask how much everything was, even though he was standing right next to the price tags of stuff, and it was very annoying. This kind of stuff continued for 6 months straight. A lot of the time during this happened, there would be others that came in at the same time as he, in order to get alcohol, and they lived in the housing complex, because they all knew the screaming guy. I guess he was hot topic in the apartments. Anyway, one night this screaming guy leaves, and a different guy that's also in the store comes up to me and tells me to not let him into the store anymore, because he's got bad juju. I'm a pretty level-headed guy and skeptical, but what this guy told me creeped me out. He said he's positive the screaming guy lives alone in his apartment, and he was invited into his place once because he was less crazy at that point and then got worse. The dude tells me that when he was in Crazy Guy's apartment, that he would feel like someone would pop out at any moment, and that he felt like he was being watched, and it felt like a very negative place to be in. The day gets later, and the normal dude decides to leave, and when he left Crazy's place, he looked in his apartment window from the outside and saw multiple shadows that looked like human shapes walking past the shades of the windows. He said he went back one more time to hang out, but never did again when the Crazy started saying that they're stealing his thoughts and memories. So I hear the stories and am now like, wow, that's nuts. And the normal guy just says that he's not trying to freak me out, but that it's just better to be far away because trouble follows him. So one day the Crazy Guy comes back at midnight, Same time as always, and I tell him he's not allowed in the store anymore. And he begins to walk around the store and ask how much everything is. And I'm begging him to leave at this point, and he gets mad at me and says he's not going to leave until he can bag a buy of Cheetos. So I sell them to him, and it's around 3:03 a.m. at this point, and he picks up the chips and says, "They see you now. They don't like you," and then walks out and literally starts screaming at the top of his lungs in the parking lot. I locked those doors so fast it was insane. A few weeks pass, and I barely saw him, but he always said, "They see you," when he'd come in. One day I worked a mid-shift and got off at 11:30 p.m. I clocked out and started walking down the street to my house, and I see the crazy guy sitting on a chair on the second story of the apartment complex, outside what I assume is his apartment. And I see him in the chair, and then I look at his window, and the curtains are closed. But I saw 3 human-shaped silhouettes like solid shadows right up against the window, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I remembered the story the guy told me. I ran home so fast, I thought I was going to break the sound barrier. I've had more than my fair share of creepy encounters, but this one was particularly dramatic. One where I really did feel my life was in danger. I was on holiday visiting family in South Asia. Having been born and brought up in England, a lot of things over there are quite foreign to me. We, my parents and I, were staying at my uncle's apartment. My aunt and uncle were at work, and my parents had gone away for a day trip to visit relatives in a neighbouring town, leaving me at home with my 2 cousins, Hamish and Adam. Adam was 8 years old at the time, and Hamish was 3, and I was about 13. Adam and Hamish always argued about everything. If one wanted a particular cereal for breakfast, an argument would break out over breakfast choices. Adam is stupid for wanting Cocoa Pops. My Shreddies are so much better. I'm not even going to sit here and eat while he eats. Anyway, that sort of stuff. While playing with a toy, let's make the doll swim in the lake. No, it's not a lake, it's the sea. And so on and so forth. I was very used to them disagreeing and squabbling, and couldn't remember any time when they were in harmony, especially over playtime. This might seem like a digression, but it's relevant to this story. On this particular day, Hamish was in the living room, building a Lego boat he had been working on for a few days now. Adam had gone outside to play with his friends on the street. He'd left the door slightly ajar so that he could come and go. It was a hot and humid day as usual, so I went to take a shower and was sitting in my room drying my hair, when Hamish came running in tears. "Tashina, my boat, it's broken." "What?" "My Lego boat, someone stepped on it and broke it." "Oh." He grasped my hand and led me to the living room where the boat was snapped. He was upset. It had been his pride and joy, and so I commiserated and reassured him that not all hope was lost and that it shouldn't take too long to fix. I thought he must have broken it himself by accident, perhaps stepping on it and not realizing he had been working on the floor with the boat sitting in the living room rug. With Hamish finally place-sated and back to work on his boat, I returned to my room, and a few minutes passed without incident. I could hear Hamish moving around, and I heard Adam come back inside and go to the living room. I got a book and curled up on the bed. It was a lazy, drowsy sort of day. And then, all of it was shattered. Adam and Hamish came charging into my room and was tripping over each other, screaming my name. Hamish ran to me and Adam paused to slam on the bedroom door to close it behind him. "There's a man in our living room. He's wearing a mask, and he had a knife. He must have been the one who broke my boat." "Wait, what?" I look at the pair of ashen faces, completely solemn. "Are you playing some sort of game?" "No, he's wearing a horrible, scary mask, and he has a knife." If they were play acting, and if this was some sort of pretend game. "Where is he?" "In the living room," Adam said, pointing. "He's wearing a mask?" "Yes, like a Halloween mask with a big scary smile on it." "Smile showing teeth," said Hamish, nodding along furiously. "And a knife," said Adam. "A big knife," said Hamish. They looked entirely serious and terrified, looking at me with their upturned, earnest and pleading faces. I think more than anything, it was the fact that they agreed upon the description of this man and what he was carrying that really cemented upon me that they were telling the truth. If this had been some sort of pretend game, they would have disagreed by now, trying to outdo each other in what he was wearing, or perhaps the weapon he was carrying. Instinctively, I went to the door. I wasn't sure why, or to achieve what purpose. I still wasn't scared. I knew they were telling the truth. But could there be an innocent explanation? They were overexcitable kids. My hand went to the door handle. "No," said Adam in a hiss, as they both came running towards me, their hands clawing at me. "Don't go there." "Wait. Okay, let me get this straight. He was in the living room." They nodded. "What was he doing? How did you manage to escape? Did he threaten you?" "I was sitting on the sofa watching TV," said Adam. "Hamish was on the floor with his boat. The man came in and we saw the knife." "What happened then? Was he pointing it at you?" "No, it was just in his hand. As soon as we saw him, we ran and came to you." The living room has two doors. One that leads to a corridor that basically snakes around the front of the building, and the other one that leads to a corridor to the inside of the apartment. The boys had taken this latter doorway, with a man presumably standing by the first one. This story did indeed make sense. It had come so suddenly and was taking me a while to actually process the seriousness of what they were telling me, that there was an intruder inside the apartment with a knife, and I was the oldest, so I was in charge. They had to come to me for protection. Oh God, what to do? Okay, let's not panic. We need to call the cops. Mobiles were still uncommon in this era. The only phone in the apartment was the landline, and luckily it was right outside my room. It was on the table in the corridor facing the door to my room. However, it wasn't a cordless phone, so if the cord was long enough, I might be able to grab the whole thing and pull it inside and close the door. I rehearsed it in my mind. I need to get the phone so we can call the police. "No, the man will get you," said Hamish, clinging at my arm. "He might be in the corridor," said Adam. We were all slightly whispering. "Well, we can check," I said, my hand going for the handle. "No," hissed Adam, as he grabbed my hand, insisting it was dangerous. And I told them I'd just take a peek. Adam, eventually, and reluctantly agreed. I turned the handle slowly, and my stomach felt tight as I did so. The tension of the boys standing next to me didn't help the matters. When it was slightly ajar, I pressed my face into the gap and looked around. The corridor was dark and empty. "Okay," I said, turning to face the boys. "There's no one there. I'm going to sneak out and grab the phone and come back, okay? As soon as I get back in with the phone, you close the door behind me. It's only a few steps to the phone. It'll just take a few seconds, don't worry." Adam was a mess, wringing his hands, pleading with me not to go. Hamish stood stoic, nodding, and I pulled the door open further and stepped out. Hamish and Adam crowded into the space I had just vacated, peering out the doorway to watch me. As I stepped outside into the empty, quiet corridor, I began to feel silly. Could this just be the boys' active imagination? Had they seen something on TV and become convinced it was real? Maybe I was just being stupid. Maybe there was no one there, and I was feeling much calmer and incredulous about the whole situation. Still, it was possible, but better to be safe than sorry. I would take the phone inside and call my uncle to come home. I stepped up to the table, took the phone, quickly assessing it, and tugged on the cord that plugged it into the wall. Yes, it should be long enough to take inside. I picked the whole thing up and looked up. He was standing there wearing a clown-like grinning mask, knife in hand. I don't think I need to tell you it was the most stomach-dropping, terrifying moment. The shock and fright felt like something had just smacked me in the face. I couldn't scream. I dropped the phone and just leapt back to the door, slamming it into Adam and Hamish as I did so. All three of us banged the door shut. Adam and Hamish stood leaning against the door, and I dragged my bed in an adrenaline-fueled frenzy. There was no lock on the door. Would the bed be strong and heavy enough to hold it? I began piling everything I could onto the bed to make it even heavier. Adam and Hamish wordlessly joined in. The books on the bookshelf, all my bags, my suitcase, my clothes, the clock, everything. And then we all sat down on the bed, clambering onto it, leaning against the upper part of the door to make sure it wouldn't open. Now that we were all still, we could just look at each other. Adam began to cry. He was bawling in a thin, whiny voice. "Oh my God, we're gonna die," he wailed. No, we're not gonna die," I said, though my heart was still pounding painfully against my chest, and I felt like I was gonna be sick. Hamish was just sitting quietly next to me, his little hands folded across his chest. "We're gonna die," Adam said again. I told him to calm down. I thought about what we could do. We couldn't stay here forever. We could just wait until he leaves. I don't think I'll ever forget the image. Little Hamish, 3 years old, sitting next to me looking solemn, his legs out in front of him, clad in those little jeans, with his hands clasped in his lap, his back leaning against the door, and Adam on the other side of me, his knees pulled up to his chest, tears streaming down his face, making whimpering noises. All of us in a row barricaded against the door, and we could hear footsteps in the corridor occasionally. The time pressed on, but our tension didn't wane. With every passing second, we expected to hear a thud on the door, and the man trying to get in. Thankfully, it didn't happen. We eventually heard my aunt come in talking in the corridor, wondering where we were and calling us. It was amazing, but there was a tinge of dread in case the man was still in the apartment, in case he might attack her. Hastily running outside, we told her what happened and searched the place, emboldened by the presence of an adult, but there was no sight of the man. The frustrating thing was, though my uncle and aunt, when they got home from work, didn't believe us at all, she thought we were flat out lying for entertainment, which I found particularly undermining, given that at 12 years old, and mature enough for my age, I would never make something up as serious as that. First she laughed and rolled her eyes, waving us away when we persisted and repeated, insisting it did really happen and that we were telling the truth. She eventually grew tired and told us to stop. I still find it astonishing how lightly they can take the complaints of children. We were shaken up for the rest of the day and feeling very indignant at having been just shooed away after something so terrifying had happened. When my parents got back, we told them, and it was some solace that they did indeed take us seriously. They knew that it was completely out of character for me to dream up or lie about something like that. My aunt and uncle, however, still didn't agree. Later in the evening, after we were getting ready to go out to dinner, we heard my aunt cry out in surprise, and my uncle rushed to see what happened. It turns out all of her jewellery was gone, and that was when they finally did indeed believe that we had been telling the truth, and there was an intruder. When I was a teenager, my family moved into a new house in Ohio. As soon as we moved in, my mother started saying that she felt the house was haunted, and she could sense a presence there. She said she heard someone call her name, and that she felt someone put a hand on her shoulder. There was one time, she woke up with someone holding her feet down, and she couldn't shake whatever it was and started screaming. She also heard muffled voices. We didn't believe her at all until both my sister and I started experiencing strange things. My first experience was when I was reading a book in my bedroom at 3 a.m. I am a night owl, and it wasn't that unusual. Everyone should have been asleep, but suddenly I heard very faint footsteps right outside my bedroom door. They were too heavy to be my mum's or sister's, so I assumed my dad was walking around checking up on us. I sprinted to the door, and when I opened it, I was shocked to discover the hallway was dark and no one was up there. Our attic had several feet of fluffy insulation covering the entire area. There was nothing stored there, and at times you could hear steps coming from the attic, running up to the side of the house with the driveway, when someone was pulling up to the house, as if they wanted to see who had arrived. It was almost cool in the daytime, but terrifying at night. There was always something clicking loudly under my bed, as well as in the closet at night. I always tried to convince myself it was air vents. However, all the air vents were on the other side of the bedroom and never made clicking noises. I sometimes saw an outline of a person standing next to my bed if my head was covered with a sheet, and when I'd pull it off, there'd be no one there. I'd hear sighs as if someone was standing right behind me, and there was one occasion where I heard a whisper, "Come play." I prayed a lot, and that usually helped. I'd also ask them to quiet down, and that helped too. One time, my boyfriend and I were doing homework in the basement, and heard the garage door open and the voices of my parents in the kitchen. We ran up to say hello, to discover an empty house. There was another time when my boyfriend stayed overnight. He slept in the living room, and in the morning he asked if we were playing a joke on him at night, as he kept hearing a ball bounce on the stairwell leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor, and in the kitchen. But every time he got up to see what was going on, no one was there. I don't think we even owned a ball, and certainly didn't play with one in the house. One time my mum heard a baby cry outside of our house at night. We lived in a safe and perfectly normal suburb, and there was no reason a baby would be in our backyard. One day, a lid flew off a cooking pot and got halfway embedded into the kitchen ceiling. It wasn't a pressure cooker, just a regular lid and a pot. Another time we left for a family vacation, and my boyfriend was asked to take our paper in. He said he was in the house and decided to make my bed, as we left at some ungodly hour like 5 a.m, and I never got the chance to do it. He said at first he got a juice and felt like someone was breathing down his neck. He kept turning around to find no one there. Then he walked upstairs, and while he was making my bed, he felt something grab his leg from underneath the bed. He got freaked and ran out, and refused to enter the house again, and just diligently hid the papers behind a flower pot outside until we returned. My sister one night awoke to a black-caped figure standing silently in her room. She said there was also a bright orb near her window, as her window faced the backyard and trees, and being on the second floor, there was no possible source of lights from cars. She covered her head with the blanket, and when she looked out, the figure and orb were still there. She went back under the blanket, and after some time they were finally gone. Our cat disappeared without a trace someday as well. We are unsure if it's related. My dad was one person who never experienced anything. No voices, no steps, no TVs and radios blasting out on their own. He is hard of hearing, so that could have been a factor. But one thing he can't explain is waking up at 4 a.m. next to a lit tea light candle that he swears burnt out at midnight. The candle was right in front of his face, and he's extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he covered any electronic lights with napkins as they disturb his sleep. It eventually got so bad that I refused to sleep in my own bedroom, as I could feel someone moving around in the room at night, and I slept in my sister's room. My dad decided to call a medium, and the guy said that there were 5 spirits in the house: a boy, an old lady, a couple, and a very angry man. He gave us a giant candle with a cross and said to burn it in the bedroom of the youngest child, which was now also my bedroom where I slept in a sofa chair. The candle was in a big glass jar and was hefty. All night it kept shaking, and the glass kept making clicking noises against the counter it stood on. We were also to tell the spirits that this was our house now, and they needed to go to the light. Things improved after the visit, and shortly after I moved out to attend college, where I slept with the lights on, although I never experienced any paranormal activity in my apartment there. After college, I never stayed in the house for longer than a few days, always sleeping with the lights on, as the creepy feeling remained despite nothing noticeable happening anymore. Eventually, my parents sold the house. When I was 8, my entire family moved from San Diego County to the middle of nowhere in Colorado. After less than 2 years of being there and having to put up with the ridiculous weather, my oldest brother decided he's finally had enough. He got his GED and left his ferrets behind for us to take care of them, since they're illegal in California, and headed west to move in with a friend. Or at least he tried to. He didn't even make it 5 hours before his car completely died because it couldn't handle driving through the Rockies. He was stranded in a tiny podunk town after dark, and his car got towed to a garage while the tow truck driver offered to drive him to a cheap but nice motel to spend the night, since we couldn't get to him until the next day. They passed by a Motel 6 or some other chain motel like that, but the driver said, "Ugh, I wouldn't leave my dog in a place like that. There's a way nicer motel just down the road for the same price," and kept driving until they showed up at this really run-down looking place. My brother thought it looked pretty bad, but he's kind of a shy and non-confrontational person. He's also scrawny and completely unintimidating, so he didn't say anything and just thanked the guy. He couldn't see it at night, but when my mum and I got there the next day, we realized just how weird the place was. They had a big pool right smack in the middle of the parking lot, but it was drained dry and looked like it had never been used. The entire family that owned the place, mom, dad, daughter and son, sat on plastic lawn chairs in between the pool and the building, facing the motel rooms all day long. Then we saw the inside of his room. The bathroom had a small window, which isn't unusual, but it was only 2 feet off the ground and next to the toilet, with nothing covering it or obstructing the view of anyone using the toilet, meaning anyone outside, like the owners, could watch you doing your business. There wasn't even a spot for a toilet paper holder, so the roll just had to sit on a shelf, and the whole room looked pretty run down. My brother then quietly told us he barely got any sleep the night before, because he was so terrified. At first, we assumed it was just because he was sleeping in a strange place alone when he was only 17, but he pointed out a door near his bed. His room was the kind where it's connected to the room next to it by a hallway only a few feet long with a door in each room. So large families staying in adjacent rooms can keep it open and get between the two without having to deal with keys. He said he heard a faint noise coming from the next room to his the night before. So we opened the door to see what was going on, and there was enough of a gap underneath to see that someone was standing right on the other side of the far door. My brother watched for a few minutes, and the guy's shadow never shifted, so he got creeped out and closed his own door, making sure to lock it, and went to bed. He woke up at some point to a strange sound and sat there trying to identify it for a minute before he suddenly realized it was a doorknob rattling. The guy had finally opened his own door and was trying to get into my brother's room. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but he was too scared to fall back asleep in case the guy tried again and picked the lock. And he was just telling us this story quietly, in case the guy could hear him through the walls. He never saw what he looked like, but who knows if the guy watched him while he checked into the room or something. I have no idea what he was planning on doing to my brother, but I'm sure it wasn't good. Add this to the strange, frustrating conversation my mum had with the owner of the hotel over the phone on the drive up, and the weird-ass mechanic shop the car was towed to, and the town became one of the creepiest places we'd ever had the misfortune of stopping in. It would have cost more to fix the car than it was actually worth, so we just abandoned it, and my brother had to come home again, which he was actually happy to do after such a freaky experience. In 1988, I quit my job as a teacher in San Francisco and moved back with my parents in East Sacramento, in their guest house. It was a nice little cabin type with a small sitting area near the kitchenette, and the sound of shrubbery near my bedroom was relaxing. During the summer, I was taking a refresher course in alternative teaching methods in a nearby town called Rancho Cordova, and I was there for most hours of the morning from 9 till 12, and I would take the bus home. It was a really nice place to live, and the houses were beautiful. Who wouldn't want to live there? Not me. When I'd walk through Sacramento, I'd imagine walking through the busy streets of the hate. I had to be there, so I had no other choice, and the teaching job I was doing to have at Folsom Middle School seemed promising. On a sunny afternoon, I walked home from the bus stop and noticed the neighbor's son, at only 10, was sitting on the parents' lawn. I asked him if he was okay, and he looked at me dazed. "There's a man looking in your window," he said. I thought maybe he'd seen my dad, and that was it. I asked him to carry my books while I unlocked the door, and told him it was probably my father. "No, he was looking from the outside," he said. Once again thinking he was just a kid with an imagination. What did he look like? He said it was a man wearing a black mask like the Hamburglar. This was California, and David had never seen snow, so it's likely he'd never seen a ski mask, and it sounded like that was what he was describing. For a second I considered reporting it, but it was only the basis of a child who said a man who looked like the Hamburglar was looking in my parents' living room window. I let him inside, let him have a soda, and walked him across the street. The rest of the afternoon I sat on the patio of the guest house, smoking cigarettes and reading Stephen King. I lifted my head up to take a sip from my Coke when I saw a shadow duck behind the garden shed. It was almost like at the moment when Annie and Laurie are walking home in Halloween and the shape hides behind the hedges. Almost like that. Cigarette in hand, I walk over to the garden shed slowly. "David, if that's you, go home." I looked behind and there was no one there, but beside it there were 2 footprints where someone wearing heavy boots was standing. I was freaked, but it could have easily been anybody, even the neighbor. I went inside and put on a record really loud, leaving the window open and sitting back on the patio reading my book. I thought if there was someone creeping about, maybe playing music would scare them to thinking someone was home. A knot was tightening in my stomach, and the more I thought about it, the more I was tempted to look up from my page to see if the shadow would jump out from behind the shed once more. I grew up there and never felt like East Sacramento was a place for prowlers. It seemed too much of a sunshine land for that. I blew the thought off and decided to pick the needle up, turn the stereo off, lock up, and go to an old friend's house until my parents returned home. I went to my cousin Cindy's house. She'd just married her boyfriend straight out of high school. Cindy was a kindred spirit and would go on to marry 4 more times by 1999 before she had her first son. "Call the police, that's what I'd do," she said, rinsing her hair in the sink. She just finished coloring it with food dye. Her husband, Brad, at the time, offered to go over there before he had to go to work at the video store. Brad wasn't butch or strong, but he pretended he was. I felt stupid. A grown-ass adult that was too scared to go home because the bogeyman was hiding in the garden shed. That place always gave me the creeps. It's dark. There's spiders. Cindy laughed. "But we never thought there was someone in there," I replied to her. I called my mother at her prayer group and she came to pick me up. I felt even more pathetic than I did before. I told her what I'd seen and what David said. She said that I was scaring myself and to not be silly. She laughed, and I thought perhaps she was right. That was until I came home to find the kitchenette window in the guest house had its screen taken off, put neatly against the wall. Nothing had been taken, but things had been moved. Odd things. Some records were pulled slightly off the shelf. A picture of an old friend had been placed face down, and there was an empty beer can in my trash can. I don't drink, and some of the food in my fridge had been eaten. My degree was now on a different hook. Either some jackass broke into my house to move some stuff and have lunch, or I was going crazy. After this, I started getting obscene phone calls like heavy breathing and whispers that I couldn't understand. I asked the police what to do, and they told me to put in new locks on the doors and call my phone company to change my number. When I asked them if there was something they could do, they said they couldn't because I had no evidence these things were related and nothing was stolen. I prepared to move and decided I wasn't going to wait around to be the victim of crime. One afternoon I'd come home from work to hear the phone ringing. I dropped my student's work on the outside chair and quickly unlocked the door, picked up the phone and said, "Hello?" There was nothing. "Hello, anybody there?" They were calling me a whore in this high-pitched whisper. I'd had enough. I moved that weekend in with my cousin Cindy until I could find somewhere else. My parents never experienced the phone calls and never found their things misplaced. For some time I considered it was a student I gave a bad grade or someone following me home. I'd like to know who it was. It'll eat me alive otherwise. I've gone on long enough without knowing, and maybe I will never know. I work at a grocery store as a cashier, and I've met so many different types of people that I'd rather not meet again. But this one takes the cake for sure. The store I work at is open 24 hours, and this was one of the first times I had to work the night shift. Most people don't do grocery shopping past 10 PM, so night shifts are usually just one cashier and one manager. My manager was in her office, and I was on my phone trying my best to stay awake. Since I don't usually work night shifts, I was struggling a little bit more once it hit me about 12:30 AM. It wasn't busy, and the parking lot was desolate except for my car, my manager's car, and another car sitting by the line of shopping carts. The car was running with the headlights off, but with the interior lights on and a fairly large bald dude sitting hunched over with his hands firmly holding the top of the steering wheel and staring inside the store. I was very startled by this because of how eerie and creepy it felt. After a few seconds of me staring back at him, he turned his car off and the interior lights and got out of the car. He started walking around to grab a card. I wrote it off as maybe he didn't know that we were 24 hours and was trying to read the sign on the door. I ignored the fact that he would have needed his headlights on to read it. He came into the store and started scanning the aisles. I went back on my phone because if it was just an average Joe, then I didn't want him to feel uncomfortable. About 15 to 20 minutes pass, and he comes up to the checkout with a cart full, and I mean full, of jars of mayonnaise and a single vegetable platter. This was so confusing, but I tried not to be judgmental. He took a little while to start unloading the cart because he was scanning the magazine racks that most registers have right there at the checkout. We grabbed one of those teen celebrity magazines, like 17 or J14 or something, which didn't really help in the creep factor. He started unloading the cart, and I scanned the jars as soon as they came up, so that we could get this over as fast as possible. He greeted me with, "Hey, how are you, young lady?" But he said that in a Daffy Duck voice. I was beginning to get more scared rather than creeped out. I ignored it and asked him if he had a rewards card for our store. He said no in a normal voice, and I gave him the total of his transaction, and he fumbled around in his pockets for his wallet. He asked me if I liked his impression and if it was good. Honestly, the impression was pretty spot on, which is why it was freaking me out so much. I told him that it was good, while trying to stay polite and calm. He handed me some cash, and I opened the register to get his change. As I was handing him the change, he held onto my hand and leaned over the credit card machine and asked me if I'd ever been to a party with that much mayonnaise. I said no, and pulled my hand away, which he reluctantly let go of. He was still leaning over the credit card machine and said, "Well, I won't get into too much detail, but let's just say it's not for the veggies." He winked and put his change in his wallet and began taking his grocery bags and putting them in his cart. He began acting like he was in pain and asked me to help him put the bags in his car. I was not about to do that because this guy was beyond creepy. I told him that I wasn't allowed to leave the register because I was the only one working. He tried to push it, but I told him again that I wasn't allowed to leave. I don't know if that was actually a rule, and honestly neither did I, but I used it as an excuse just not to go with him. He gave me a puppy dog face and pleaded with his hands, and I told him once again that I was not allowed to leave, and that if he didn't stop I would call my manager down. He stopped immediately, scoffed at me, and left without another word. He loaded his car and left the cart in the parking lot. It was close enough though to the line of carts that was right next to his car, as I'm assuming he probably wanted to see if I would come out and put it back, but I wasn't going to do that. He got into his car, turned it on, assumed the same position he had been in before, and I called my manager down after 3 minutes of him just staring. She came down, looked out the window, and he drove away. I told her everything that happened, and she said that I was in the right by not giving him what he wanted, and that if I saw him again to call the cops. Apparently this wasn't the first time he'd done something like this during the night shift to a couple of other female co-workers. Needless to say, I made sure I never had another encounter on the night shift again after that.
This happened to me when I was about 14. I was best friends with this girl called Robin. We've long since parted ways, but I used to stay over at hers all the time. Robin was an only child to an older couple, both roughly about 60. Her house was old, and the bedrooms were quite small. She had a thing for decorating her room in spooky things. It was overcrowded with trinkets and clothes, which looked really cool. But it meant that after we were done watching trashy 90s anime, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I could go to sleep in this spare room, or I would risk suffocating under a pile of gothic teddy bears and Pokemon on her floor. One evening her parents went out to the local pub just down the street with some old friends, so I stayed over. It was great, free house for just the two of us, and they made sure we had all the junk food we could want. They were really sweet and always made sure we felt safe before leaving. I should also mention that they never brought guests home, especially when their daughter had a friend over. For the most part, I had a great night. When it was time to go to sleep, I went into what I call my room because I was there so often. It was small and just fit a wardrobe, dresser and double bed, which, considering how I had a single bed and shared a room with my sister, it was a luxury. We would usually spend hours sending each other DS PictoChat messages until one of us fell asleep. I curled up into bed and passed out pretty quickly. Sometime at 4 a.m., I awoke to someone fidgeting at the door handle. At first I was a bit confused, as Robin would almost always message me through PictoChat if she was going to come into my room. The door was rattling at this stage, and I was a bit freaked. It lasted a few minutes. The rattling subsided, and I rolled over and tried to calm myself down, thinking it might have been her dad or mum making sure the door was closed. I don't know. I was confused. I'm not sure at this point if I fell asleep or what, but I didn't hear anyone entering the room, and then I heard this splashing sound. I remember thinking it was really loud and clear, and as the seconds went by I realized this wasn't part of the dream or something. I was actually hearing it. So as I was facing the wall, I rolled my head around as silently as I could, and I could see this very tall man next to my bed facing the corner. He was so close to me. He was at least 6'3" tall, had thick black short hair, and was incredibly pale and toned. He looked to be in his early 30s, and he was wearing nothing but a pair of black boxer shorts. There was no way this could have been her dad. While he was almost as tall as this guy, her dad was visibly older, had silver hair, and the top of his head was bald. There was no way anyone could confuse him with this guy. I was in shock. I had no idea what was happening, and I remember feeling my heart in my mouth. I didn't know what to do. I just stared in shock for a few seconds, and then as quietly as I could, I turned back around and pretended to be asleep. I remember trying to control my breathing so he wouldn't notice. Eventually he left, and I was aware for what felt like an hour
too afraid to move. I don't know who this guy was, and if he was still outside my door. Did he see me? If he saw me, what would he do? I didn't hear anyone else in the house, and there was no talking, and the walls of the house were paper thin. When I eventually worked up the nerve, I darted into Robin's room and broke down. I was panicking, and she was laughing at me, saying I was being ridiculous, and that I was lying, that I was just having a nightmare. She told me to go back to bed, and I refused. I didn't feel safe. She rolled her eyes, and we both went into the room. She looked around and suddenly started shrieking. She had just stepped into a puddle of piss. I told you. It was everywhere. It was on the wardrobe, on the dresser, and soaked into the carpet. At this point, she was just as confused as I was. Even so, it was 5 a.m., so she grabbed my pillow and blanket from my room, and I gladly took my chance with the teddy avalanche and slept on her floor. The next morning, I remember being incredibly wary of her dad. There were no other male figures around, and they weren't the kind of people to have guests over, especially when their daughter had guests over. So, I directed my fear and confusion at him. I knew it wasn't him though, but at that point I was just so anxious around any kind of male figure. I remember sitting around the breakfast table and Robin was still not sure what to make of it. Somehow part of her didn't want to believe me, even when she saw the evidence for herself. I didn't say anything to her parents, neither did she. I went home scared and confused out of my mind, and out of my friends and family, no one seemed to believe me. It wasn't until recently that I retold the story to a group of friends, and my best friend, who I was friends with at the time, reacted with, "Wait, that was real? We all thought you were just making that up." Later on, my sister told me that the houses in the area were connected through the attics, and you can get from one house to the other. Maybe someone crawled through there and had gotten in. But why were they almost naked? Why did they know I was there? I never really understood what happened. Needless to say, I never slept in that room and never slept alone in that house again. I live in a house in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods, so it's always had that potential to be creepy, especially at night when all the deers, coyotes, and other animals are making noises in the woods. The house was built about 13 years ago by my family, so we are the only ones to have lived in it. I don't know anything about the property other than it's in the country by some cornfields and a few other houses. Ever since I was a kid, there has been one room in the house that has always given me a weird feeling when I was in there by myself, and that is my mum and my stepdad's room. Anytime I was in there alone, I just felt odd, like I was on edge. However, this could just be because my mum never really liked me in her room. It is just a feeling of almost being watched, or that I needed to hurry out of there. Like I said, it could be because of my mum's rule, so I'm automatically assuming this means my house is haunted. On Tuesday I was home alone, no pets, nothing, and I was getting ready to go out. My mum has this hair product in her bathroom which is attached to her bedroom that I love, so I stroll over down the hall in order to obtain some. As I was styling my hair, I hear a noise, like a smacking sound. I'm 100% certain of what I heard, as this sounded as if someone took their open bare hand and hit it off the wall 3 times. The sound seemed to have come from around where the door to her room is, or from the hallway where it opens up to a large entryway, because the smacks did not seem muffled, so it didn't sound like it was coming from another room, the attic, or any other part of the house. I immediately froze, because I thought I was busted by my mum or stepdad for stealing some product and they were messing with me, or someone was knocking on the door to the house. I almost immediately left the bathroom and peered around her door down to the entryway to look at the door, which has a large glass panel. I saw no one standing there. I ran downstairs quickly to see if someone was pulling out of our driveway, like UPS or FedEx or perhaps even Jehovah's Witnesses, but there was no one leaving. We have a long driveway too, so it's not like someone could pull out quickly. Now at this point, I obviously start to freak out, and every horror movie I have seen and story I had read had come to mind. I grabbed my things to finish getting ready at my friend's house and left. I spent at least 15 minutes getting my things together, and in that time nothing else happened. But as I said, as soon as I had my things, I ran to my car and left. On a lighter note, I was caught by our security camera running to my car, in my PJ tops and shorts, with Uggs on my feet and crying. After the fact, it was kind of funny, but I was definitely terrified. For a long time now, my mum and stepdad have not gotten along. For years, there was almost constant tension of arguments, and that is the room where they both had to sleep together. However, they have recently decided to separate, so the arguments have all but subsided. My question is, could the years of hate, tension, sadness and anger build up to create or invite something into the home? If this were the case, why was it showing itself now, when things are finally coming to a resolution, with both of them looking for new places to live? I of course called my stepdad in tears, suggesting a person could have even have broken in, as I was trying to rationalize it. He said he thought it could be a mouse in the attic. We live next to a field, remember? A loose side panel on the house from recent extreme winds, or ice from the ice machine in the kitchen. Now bear in mind, I've heard all these noises before. I know what they sound like, and I don't think that they're the case. He checked the cameras, and I was the only person to enter and leave. Of course, everyone thinks I'm overreacting, but I am confident in what I heard, and the fact that it gave me chills. This happened 2 years ago, when I had just finished high school. I was 18 at the time, and I was not the most popular girl in my school. However, I did not go completely unnoticed. I'm mentioning this to you because I'm attractive as a female, and I do work out occasionally. I'm half Hispanic, half Caucasian, have light fair skin and dark black hair. I'm only telling you this so that you have an idea of what I look like. The thing is, I didn't have any friends. I have trust issues, which is a story for another time. I wasn't that close to my family either, so most of my social life and interactions were online. In my social life, I communicated with mostly cute guys in my city. Preferably, I only talked to younger guys, and if they were not in my city, I didn't reply because I didn't have a car. This also means that when I would go out on dates, these guys would have to pick me up. Most of my dates were nothing serious. It was mostly fun and games, but I did eventually want a relationship. Eventually, I came upon this Facebook message from this guy with a simple greeting. "Hi, how are you?" He seemed completely normal. He was not the most attractive guy that I would normally go out with, but something about him caught my attention, and I couldn't really describe it. You know that feeling when they might feel like they're the one, even if you've never met them? I do believe that I was destined at one point to cross paths with my potential soulmate, so I decided to give this guy a shot. His name was Tyler, and looking at his Facebook profile, He was pretty slender but fit. He had fair white freckled skin and his hair was ginger, which I also really liked about him. I had a thing for gingers. After reviewing his profile, which I'm sure everyone does before replying to someone they don't know, I decided to respond to Tyler and get to know him a little more. We eventually got into a conversation and we shared some similarities. After a week of conversation, we both decided it was time to meet in person. I was not conflicted about meeting Tyler in person because I had nothing else going on. I was not working yet and I had just finished high school, so I had a lot of free time on my hands. The day we decided to meet came around, and Tyler already knew about my situation of not having a car, so he had planned on picking me up, and I decided to wear a cute, short black dress with a sweater over it because it was slightly chilly outside, and I kept my long black hair straight and wore a little makeup. Sooner than later, the time Tyler was supposed to pick me up was here. It was around 9 p.m, which was the time we agreed he'd come to get me. But Tyler wasn't outside my house yet. He told me that he would be driving a black minivan, but I didn't see any black cars outside my house. It was getting late. An hour had passed, and Tyler didn't respond to any of my messages, though I could see they were all read. I was about to call it off when I got a notification from my phone. Tyler said he was finally here. I was annoyed of how long he took to arrive. However, my excitement was stronger, so I decided to put my shoes on and head out. Tyler was outside the car and greeted me. I looked at him, and I noticed he was underdressed than I was. He wore an orange hoodie and sweatpants, and I felt a bit embarrassed and thought I should have wore something more comfortable. I walked over to hug him, and he opened the door for me. Before I went inside though, I noticed that there were two people inside the car. There was a guy in the driver's seat and a female in the passenger seat. Alarms were going off in my head right away, but before I could do anything, Tyler escorted me in the car. Tyler then joins me in the back seat, and I was frightened to say the least, but I didn't know what this was yet, and Tyler never mentioned there would be people joining us. From the moment I got in, I wanted to leave. I noticed Tyler's appearance to be a bit older than he'd looked on Facebook. He was still attractive but looked tired, like he hadn't slept in a while. He never spoke one word to me inside the car either, which made me feel uneasy. All he did was wink at me several times on the ride, wherever we were going. We eventually pulled up to a motel, and I had an idea where this was going but wasn't sure yet. Everyone got out the car, and I was the last to leave. The others started to make their way to the motel, and Tyler grabbed my hand and made our way behind them. When we got inside the motel room, I noticed right away a girl passed out on the bed. I knew she was just sleeping though. Everyone got settled into the room, and I did my best to play along because I did not want to give off a vibe that alarmed everyone that would be trouble. As soon as a conversation was going, I found out that the girl from the passenger seat was Tyler's sister. She had glasses and was slightly overweight, and she looked a bit like Tyler. She also hadn't slept in days. Her name was Shelby, and I think the guy driving was the boyfriend of the girl asleep on the bed, as he was trying to tell us to be quiet. Tyler was still looking at me with these predatory eyes, like he hadn't been with a woman in a while, and Shelby was talking with the other guy who I didn't know the name of yet. It was not soon after that I realized I was in trouble. I saw drugs being taken out of a bag that they had on them, with more drugs hidden around the motel room. I knew it would be more difficult to get out of this situation now, But I had to keep a brave face on because if I showed any signs of weakness, I'd be done for. Throughout this entire time being here, which felt like hours, Tyler eventually looked away from me to take out this glass pipe and a lighter. I could only describe this substance he was smoking to be meth. I'd never done drugs before, so I was frightened by the sight but kept a cool face. I was quiet the entire time. And then the other guy caught on because he asked Tyler why I was so quiet. Tyler shrugged, and then asked me the dreaded question. "Would you like to smoke this, babe?" I didn't know how to respond to that. I was shocked and scared. My mind began racing with so many thoughts. It took me a few short seconds to say, "Yeah, sure. Thanks, babe." I decided to play this out as smartly as I could. I thought if I played along, I could sneak out somehow while everyone was caught off guard. Besides, in a situation like this, you have to think on your feet and be smart. If I'd have said no, I can imagine different scenarios of me not making it through the night. So playing this out, I waited for Tyler to finish smoking the pipe until it was my turn. After watching him for a few seconds, it was my turn. Tyler passed me the pipe. I hesitantly lit it and began to inhale the smoke. I wasn't sure if I did it right, but didn't care. I must not have smoked enough though, because Tyler continually persisted me to take longer breaths. He walked over towards me and held the pipe for me so I could try it again. I coughed the first several times, and the others looked at me. They must have noticed that it was my first time doing this, but I hoped that they would think it had been a while for me. Tyler took the pipe after I was done so that he could continue, and it wasn't soon after that I began to feel lightheaded. I was starting to feel symptoms I'd never experienced before. My heart began racing faster, and my vision began to widen as I could now notice little details in the room that I couldn't before. I had butterflies in my stomach, but not the bad kind. I meant the really good kind, when you're experiencing your first kiss and the fireworks. I felt amazing, and that scared me. I wanted to leave then, but I had to keep my composure. It was really hard now, because they enhanced my fear and paranoia. Sitting the entire time there didn't make the situation any easier. Tyler then said to me, "Hey babe, you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. I just have to use the bathroom." I didn't really have to use it. I just had to move around. I didn't know if it had been what I had taken, or myself, or both. Tyler walked me over and led me to the bathroom at the end of the room, which was next to the door outside the motel. I thanked him and walked in, and attempted to lock the bathroom by first instinct, but there was no lock. I panicked a little and tried to think a way out of this little motel room. Suddenly, an idea. I could fake a phone call from someone I knew off my Facebook Messenger and see who was online. Maybe they could pick me up and get me out of here. It was the best idea in my head, so I went along with it and proceeded to pester anyone I knew who I thought could take me home. I asked several guys who seemed nice enough with the same message, explaining a short version of the situation. Most of them responded with, "Call 911. Some didn't answer. Luckily though, a very sweet guy responded to me asking for my location. I didn't hesitate and sent him my location straight away. His name was Kyle, and he looked around the same age as me, so I felt safe. After sending him my location, he sent me a message saying that he'd be there in 5 minutes. I was very happy that he wasn't that far, and I replied to his message saying thank you. I wasn't sure if I knew Kyle personally, but he did seem familiar. All I know is I had to find someone in my city on my Facebook friends list who was online and could somehow take me away from these junkies. And I did, so that was taken care of. Now all I had to do was find a way to explain to Tyler why I had to leave. I flushed the bathroom toilet, and even though I didn't use it, I washed my hands. I exited and noticed Shelby and the guy leaving the room. I saw Tyler continue to smoke the glass pipe, walked over to him, and took the time to think of a reason to tell him why I had to leave as he continued smoking. Thinking fast on my feet, I thought of stupid explanations to escape. After he finished his pipe, he looked at me and said, "Feeling all better, baby? You took a while, so I got worried. My sister and Vince went to grab snacks for us, so they left really quick to the gas station." I replied back saying, "Sorry about that, just been having lady problems. And is that the guy's name, Vince?" "Yeah, that's Vince. He's stolen from us before, so we're hanging out with him, pretending to like him." I hesitantly replied, asking, "Oh, what did he steal from you?" "He stole my sister's car and never returned it, so we're keeping him real close. You know what I'm saying? Keep your friends close and your enemies closer." I chuckled to Tyler softly, pretending to agree with him. I then had a bright idea to make an excuse to leave. "Hey Tyler, I have to check on my big brother. He said he'd be picking me up tonight and I have to see when he's coming to get me." He looked annoyed when I told him this, but I didn't care. I went on my phone and tried to call Kyle, who I messaged earlier, and he picked up after the first ring and told me he was there. I told him I'd be 2 minutes. I walked back over to Tyler, made an excuse how he's earlier than expected, and why I had to go. He stood up, glass pipe in hand, and told me that I wasn't leaving. I felt sick. As he said that, I wanted to throw up. I kept my composure, however, because I didn't think he would hurt me with someone else in the room, even if that person was a petite and passed out. I firmly told him, "Okay, let me run downstairs to the parking lot and tell him that I'm fine staying with you tonight." I grabbed his hand as I said this in the hopes that he would believe the lie. He looked conflicted about what I was saying, but agreed to let me walk outside to my fake brother Kyle from Facebook, who was saving me. Tyler watched me walk outside the motel room, and I could feel his eyes piercing behind my back. Even though I couldn't see him, I definitely felt it. I glanced behind me when I was going down the stairs to the parking lot to see if I was being followed. Fortunately, he wasn't. So I took that opportunity and dashed to find Carl's car. I didn't care if he heard me running to the parking lot in front of the motel as fast as I could. But then I panicked. I never asked Kyle which kind of car he drove, so I looked at every car until I saw anyone with their lights on. I then saw a car drive up to me, stop and roll down their window. It was Kyle. He opened the passenger seat and I immediately got inside. He looked worried, but I told him to just drive out of there, and he agreed. He seemed spooked by my reaction, and I didn't seem to like the area I was in either. So he drove out of there in a flash. But with my adrenaline acting like crazy, and paranoia from what I'd been taking, I kept glancing behind me, making sure we weren't being followed. But Kyle assured me we were safe. Eventually I felt safe enough, and told Kyle everything. He looked shocked by my responses, and he told me he was glad he could help me out. I told him again how grateful I was that he was there to pick me up, and he explained to me that he was glad to help a lady out if someone needed it. It was then that I found out Kyle wasn't just a stranger, but he was a date that I'd went out on a while ago from the Plenty of Fish dating app. Kyle was also a soldier who lived on a base in my area, and that made me feel safe. Once he arrived at my home, he told me to be careful with who I met up with. I hugged him, thanked him, and blocked Tyler on Facebook. I wasn't worried about Tyler knowing where I lived, because at the time a sheriff lived across from me, and Tyler knew about it too, because when he came to pick me up earlier that night, he looked around the neighborhood to see a sheriff's car across from my house. But the sheriff's car's lights weren't on, of course, which is why Tyler probably didn't get spooked right off the bat. But he did ask me earlier that night if I was the sheriff's daughter later on in the motel room. Only now do I wish I'd had said yes. I was always cautious from time to time living in my neighborhood, because he did know my address, and it wasn't until I moved that I felt safe again. To this day, I'm always careful of who I meet up with and where I'm going. And to Tyler and his junkie pals, get help, and let's not meet again. One night in November of 2017, I was 22 years old. My mum and I went grocery shopping. While standing in the bakery section, my mum and I ran into my aunt, and the three of us stood there and chit-chatted for a while. I'd been feeling generally uneasy around this time because I had recently been binge-watching a lot of YouTube videos about true crime and creepy encounters. I was having trouble sleeping, as I had been getting scared when I was home alone, and heard the tiniest noise. Due to this unease or paranoia, I was very alert and on edge in the bakery at the grocery store. I stood with my back to the bagels and kept an eye on everyone walking past us as my mum and aunt shared stories. Nobody seemed suspicious until I caught the sight of a prematurely balding man. He looked like your average mid-30s, brawny neckbeard nice guy. I remember thinking to myself, God, he's kind of creepy looking, isn't he? As he walked through the produce section in the bakery. But then I started to feel bad. Chill out, you're being way too judgmental, I told myself, going so far as to even smile to him out of sheer guilt. He's probably staring at you because you're staring at him. He's just glancing his way by. He's gonna forget about you the second he takes his eye off you. Right? Wrong. I completely forgot about this experience for just a few blissful, ignorant months. Then in January, I received a messenger request from an old friend I'd lost touch with. My long-lost friend was the first of many to reach out, saying there was a lot of buzz on Facebook about a local sex offender who had been taking pictures of young women with hair he deemed pretty, some in their 20s like me, some well below the age of 18, and posting them on a picture-sharing site. I don't know exactly how, but his online albums was stocked with, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of these pictures. He had been found out, and a bunch of screenshots were being plastered all over Facebook to raise awareness. My old friend saw a few pictures of me standing against the bagels flanked by my mother and aunt, my long hair hanging down in post-French braid waves. I felt sick to my stomach when I saw the screenshots. I told my family about what I just found out, and my brother immediately called the police to report it. As he was talking to an officer, I received more screenshots, this type of the creep's registry page. He was the man from the grocery store, the man I was initially unnerved by, the man I felt guilty about, the man that I smiled at. When my brother got off the phone with the police, he told us that they had been flooded with reports all night. While sympathetic, the policeman my brother spoke to said there was nothing they could do, as the creep was legally within his rights to take those pictures of us out in public. The man was allegedly assaulted outside of a convenience store the night his pictures were discovered, before he even realized he had been exposed, and he has since been arrested for possession of indecent images of children in an unrelated case. Fun fact, my brother had actually been aware of this guy long before, as he was apparently infamous on the net for being a sketchy white dude who was obsessed with Asian women, had a hair fetish, and oh yes, was a convicted offender. So as they say, creepy photographer, let's not meet. I work overnights at a hotel in a seedy area. I'm female and work the night audit. My personality is that of an unapproachable shrew, with the look of a sultry, overworked hotel employee. I'm currently awaiting for the police to show up so I can make my statement. It was so sudden and abrupt that I'm still shaking. An inebriated man was outside with his attractive girlfriend having a cigarette, being loud and overall being disgustingly affectionate. I remember asking myself, why are you outside doing this when you can just pay money for a place to do the exact thing in? Which I was pretty sure they'd already done. While they're doing this, unknowingly to them, I noticed a man wearing an army uniform walking towards them at a very steady pace. The army man stops right next to the inebriated guy, puts his hand on his shoulder, and says something, which I assume is bumming a cigarette. Regardless, the inebriated man stops what he's doing and starts to fumble around his pockets. I guess the man had a cigarette because he went to extend his hand out to the soldier, and all of a sudden, a red 4-door something speaks around the corner like a bat out of hell. It stops right in front of the man, and the armed guy pushes the man aside while holding his wrist, and the woman is pulled into the car, and then the inebriated man was thrown in, and they jump and they drive off. I observed all of this from my front desk, and there was nothing I could do. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how quick I could have gotten to her, I would not have been fast enough with the situation that had just taken place. So to the soldier and the people in the red car, let's never, ever meet. I remember the day very vividly. I was in first grade, my sister in preschool. My dad was out at work for the day, and my mum, who's a stay-at-home mum, was home with my sister and I. My mum had gone upstairs to shower, since it was morning, while my sister and I were downstairs on the couch watching Bob the Builder. My sister went outside to the car to grab something. The way my house is set up is that our family room, where we were watching TV, connects to our kitchen, which connects to our garage. In order to get to the car outside, my sister opened up the door leading to the garage, then opened up the garage door by pushing a button. She then walked out to the car, retrieved whatever she needed, and came back in. I guess she didn't push the button to close the garage door, and she must have left the door leading inside from the garage unlocked. Well, she was 4, and she didn't think anything of it. About a half hour elapses, and my mum comes downstairs frantically with a towel around, asking if we had taken her jewellery from her upstairs bedroom. Certainly not me. Although I was a 6-year-old girl, I wasn't interested in jewellery. My sister assured my mum she didn't take it either. Then my mum had asked if I was upstairs at all while she was washing up. No, I was downstairs watching TV with my sister. Why? She told me she had heard footsteps, and whilst was in the shower, had called out my name, but we didn't respond. At this point, I was a very good whistler, and my parents knew that I could whistle. My sister, however, couldn't blow a sound. Well, if it wasn't my sister and it wasn't me, who could have taken all her jewellery from my mum's jewellery box, even the one which she had lost the key to? My mum wrangled my sister and I outside the house in panic, still with only a towel over her, and she phoned the police and my dad. She asked my sister, "Are you sure you didn't take it? Or that your friends and you yesterday didn't play with it?" Again, my sister said no. A police officer came and searched the house and my mum's room. Being 6, I was curious and confused, so I asked some of the officers what they were doing, and kindly they explained the procedure. We never ended up finding out who the criminal was. They must have come through the garage door, which meant they would have passed my sister and me sitting on the couch. Luckily, they only wanted jewellery and not to take children, because the committer could have easily taken us as well while my mum was busy showering. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if they'd have taken us. Many of our friends and family told my parents that it could have been the painter we hired. We were getting the house painted that summer, and we trusted the man painting our house, so we would leave him alone while we went out for lunch or on our boat. Since the robbery, I've been skittish home alone. We got an alarm system, better locks, and a guard dog that same year. I would have terrible thoughts after the experience that a man would come through my window and hurt me, or sneak into the house again. My dad would have to show me videos of our breed of guard dog attacking people with protective clothes on, so that I could see my dog would defend us. To this day, I hate being home alone. The slightest sound sets me on edge, and I'll reach for the nearest bat or anything I could to defend myself while I search the house. My mum also had a tough time afterwards vacuuming the house alone, since she wanted to hear every sound. So to the man that burglarized my home, took all my mother's childhood jewelry and special jewelry, let's not meet again. I live in quite a rural region of Germany. Many castles, fields, wineries, and bits of history splattered around my surroundings. Personally, I live in a house that was built around the 50s or 60s. It's fairly old and is already getting cracks in the walls, with mold appearing in several spots with high humidity, which we are obviously trying to get rid of, but it's easier said than done, as it reappears all the time, especially during winter. I don't know that much about my house's history, as it's just an old house like many others in this village. The only remarkable feature about my house being the fact that the former mayor of this village lived here. Now, I won't start retelling stories from my childhood, as I was a generally anxious kid who'll get startled by the simplest of things, being introverted and into art. I'd also have a huge imagination, so I might as well have made some things up. Anyway, it began with simple things that many other people experienced, such as seeing shadow people, dark, faint silhouettes right in the corner of my viewing area. They could be moving or standing there. Nothing to be scared of when you get used to it though I did feel uneasy while being home alone. There were other occasions where I would hear faint voices. They'd usually be calling out my name, which does get awkward when I start asking my family if they were calling me, to find out that they were not. One of the more scary instances was when I heard, "Go away," late in the night, but perhaps I was just tired. But voices are voices and shadows are shadows. Time to get to the more interesting stuff. Certain lights can sometimes turn on without anyone being there and turn off after a while. Others begin to flicker and stop at some point. The latter especially happening very often recently. Certain objects can also sometimes fall down or be misplaced. Another incident involving a light did actually scare the living crap out of me, as it occurred late at night while I was up. It was the mirror in front of my bed. Maybe it was the mirror in front of my bed, maybe the old screws, but as I'm looking at my own reflection, I heard a loud crash as the ceiling lamp came crashing down onto the ground, nearly giving me cardiac arrest. But the cherry on top is what happened here. We used to have this project at our school, where physics students could build a radio. My older brother, being good in physics, decided to build such a radio as well, and it worked. However, it did end up in the back of our wardrobe, as back then we shared a room and stayed there for quite a while. It got quite dusty, so imagine a good and sunny day, my family being at home, and I'm spending my time in my room playing games on my bed. I look in the already mentioned mirror, and the radio starts shrieking with sound. I panic and run into the living room, asking the rest of my family if they heard it. And hell, Their confused and perplexed faces did. They asked me whether or not I made that noise, which I obviously didn't, and so I picked up the small radio and brought it into the living room. My brother tells me to open it, as it's powered by batteries. There were no batteries though. It was in fact not intact. My mum, being a superstitious woman, tells me to put it away in the attic, which I did. My younger sister is currently taking classes with the same teachers I used to have, and being a good brother, I did keep all the exams and tests I had, so she could use them to prepare herself for her impending examinations. And where did I keep them? The attic. The radio started screeching again, as my sister was looking for the papers. The same freaking radio. Other than that, it might be worth mentioning that I got cats 2 years ago, and they do sometimes stop mid-walk and stare into nothing, like walls or hallways. One of them does even start to growl, which is also unsettling. Just about 20 minutes ago, this happened to me. I'm running express checkouts and playing Pokemon Go, so I'm walking kind of slow through the hotel. I had a lot of notes about disruptive rooms, so I was trying to stay quiet to listen in order to hear people being rowdy. I'm rounding the corner on the second floor and see an older man dressed in black pants, shoes, long sleeve shirt, and seemed to be elderly, but I only saw his white hair from the back. He was walking in the opposite direction towards the staircase at the end of the hall really slowly, which led me to believe he was even more elderly than I thought. I really didn't want to talk to him because it's 2:30 in the morning and it's quiet hours, so I slowed my pace a little bit. I only had one more room to give the express checkout, so I got down near the end of the hall and slipped it under the door. I was close enough that I could see into the stairwell, so both up and down the staircases. I was about 3 doors down, not far at all, and I noticed him standing just outside the doorway. As I got closer, he started moving to go upstairs, so I figured he heard me, or saw me, and was also feeling antisocial. I was going downstairs, so no harm in walking at normal speed. I got to the last section of the doors, and he's walking very slowly up the stairs. He was only on the 4th or 5th step, and I get closer to the door to the stairwell, and then it slams shut. I jump, because not only was it loud and unexpected, but also our doors have the thing on top that slows it down so it doesn't slam. My reflexes kicked in. I rush to open the door and see what's going on, with about 5 to 10 seconds max between all of this happening. I open the door, and the man is nowhere to be found. I look up the staircase and there wasn't a guy in sight. I got to the first landing to investigate more, and I see the guy turn the corner at the opposite end of the hall, a good 40 to 50 yards at the other end. There's no human way possible for someone to get to the bottom of the staircase on the 2nd floor, all the way to the opposite end of the hall on the next floor up in the few seconds it took me to see him. Even if it wasn't an elderly man, it's still impossible, and I would have heard footsteps if he were running. He even turned the corner, still walking very slowly. My hair is standing on end. I just hope for the sake of the guests that he's not some evil spirit or something. Freaked me right out. When I was still in high school, I was crossing a bridge to go to school, and this very friendly man stopped me and asked me to fill up a survey about budgeting. I was like, okay, sure. And when I was done, he told me to fill out my contact details and gave reasons, like how he's a social worker. And of course I gave him my number. I was so dumb. But at the very least I was smart enough to give him a fake name. In 2016, I began to receive random messages from this guy and was getting super creeped out by it. He knew which school I went to because I was wearing my uniform then, and was starting to ask personal questions. I tried to avoid them all and generally didn't reply to him, but he kept texting me, albeit infrequently, maybe a message a day. And when he wished me a happy Valentine's Day, I decided enough was enough and blocked him, as I wasn't feeling safe at all. Later that year, we received a police notice calling for witnesses because they arrested a few perverts in the area I was schooling in, as there were multiple girls' secondary schools and tertiary education institutions in that area. In the notice there were several photos, and I saw the very same man, the man who approached me to fill out that survey. I was disgusted. Turns out he would use this survey as a tactic and try to approach female teenagers and take photos with them and harass them with texts later. I was shocked as well. My school was in a reputable neighborhood, and we all assumed that there wouldn't be such creeps. But goodness, were we all wrong. I was glad he was caught by the police. To the photo-taking creep, let's not meet again. But I did. After he was arrested, I graduated and started schooling in a tertiary institution in 2017. It's about an hour's drive away from where my secondary school was, and I also moved to the school dormitories nearby. As I was walking home one day, I caught sight of him lurking at a bus stop nearby. Oh boy, I could never forget his face. He looked even more creepy carrying a black bag, holding some papers that looked eerily like survey forms while holding a very old camera phone. How did I ever miss that camera phone when I encountered him last time? I was very scared. How could he be here? Wasn't he arrested last year? Wasn't he stalking me the whole time? I was almost crying and quickly called a friend and walked past him. Once he was out of sight, I ran home while on the phone. I was telling all of my schoolmates to be careful, and soon enough the school was informed. The discipline master and a few PE teachers went to apprehend the stalker, and sometime later dragged him into the school office and contacted authorities. I was informed that he was released last year because of insufficient evidence. Apparently in the place where I lived, taking photos of girls/women was not a crime. They searched his flat, and there wasn't anything incriminating other than a creepy ton of photos of female students. After this incident, he disappeared, only to be stalking other girls in another school. How I wished we would never meet again, but I still saw him roaming near my school dorm every now and then, trying to be discreet with his little camera phone. I'm moving to university soon, and would be pretty far away from him. However, I'm not sure if I will ever be free of this stalker. All that I know is that I never want him to meet again. Also, as a final note, I went to check the news and he did get arrested. The news was dated March 2019 because they'd gotten new reports in 2017. So yeah, the 1.5 year processing time is just super long, but I'm glad now there will be justice for this creep. I live in a small cul-de-sac in the middle of nowhere. The next nearest neighborhood is over 4 miles away. One night a few years ago, we got over 1.5 feet of snow overnight. So far from the main road and on the weekend, I knew that our roads would remain unplowed for quite some time. I went to my back deck door to admire the snow-draped trees and the still heavily falling flurries, when I noticed footprints leading to my door, and then turning around and leaving. I looked and saw that they came from my neighbor's side, and thought that one of their more delinquent kids played a joke as my sledding tube on the rail was popped. I decided I'd wait till later, as it was too early to call their parents. I went on Facebook after scrolling for a bit and noticed one of my neighbors closer to the entrance posted, "Did someone knock for me or something at the back door?" I immediately called her and told her that I had an idea. I called the first house on the entrance and told him what was going on. He went and checked, and sure enough, they were there too. Everyone started calling everyone else. I called the family at the far end, and they told me there was none there. Then I got a call from my next door neighbor. She called the woman that lives next to the end house, and she said that there were footprints that led to her door, but none that led away. We already called the police at this point, but we now called them back and said it's an emergency. They told us that the roads were still all unplowed, and they can't send a plow truck to clear the way as they're a privately owned company. The woman was losing it, so one of the husbands, who's a huge bear of the man from across the road, texted her to say he was coming over, to invite her over. He came and she left. We put up one guy's live feed motion recording hunting cameras facing all exits. Nothing came out. At around 7 p.m, a plow truck came as well as 3 cop cars. The couple she was staying with and her went to her house and stood in the doorway as the police searched. They found nothing, and she begged them to keep looking, so they did. 2 of the cops went into the basement again. This time only one came up. He took her to the side room, and we could hear hysterical crying. Me and a few of the other guys started towards the door when several police confronted us. They told us they found someone hiding under a cover opening in the stairwell that she didn't even know existed. A few minutes later, a scruffy man came out kicking and screaming in cuffs and was led away. In his little camp, they found blankets she'd just cleaned and put away, in the next room to hers. She stayed in other people's houses for a long time before going back. Even then, she wouldn't stay alone and sold the house next summer. He turned out to be a thrill-seeking junkie who was on probation for assault against a family member. The cops told us that they feel like he didn't want to stay at his apartment after a fight with his roommate and drove off in his roommate's car from the county over and got stuck on our unplowed roads. We all were called as witnesses in the case, and he took some electronics from her basement. But we couldn't get him on that since he never left with the stuff. It was about 4 months of court. Anyway, this is why you lock your doors. I live in a seaside town in southern Australia, one that has been settled by Europeans for over 100 years. There are plenty of alleged haunted places here and there, and I have seen and felt a few things myself. The scariest thing that happened to me was when I went to a hotel. It's been investigated by paranormal groups, and there is even a book about haunted places around southern Australia in which the hotel features. There is the story that a little girl was killed, run over by a horse and cart in the late 19th century. There's also the story of the young boy who ended his own life because of his cruel parents, and I believe I experienced the presence of this boy. I'd felt some spirits in that place, and I was pretty certain I could sense the boy. Anyway, I went home without thinking too much about it, but later on is when it became interesting. That night, I got up late to use the bathroom. There was soft moonlight shining through the glass sliding door on my way in, and my way back from the lavatory to the bedroom, I saw a figure standing in the room. It looked as solid as a living person, but had its back to me. It was the form of a young boy, and I immediately knew what I was looking at and was both shocked and surprised. I was extremely scared and worried. I chose to be a coward, to rush past the figure and pretended I never noticed it. I quickly did what most people do and hid under my covers. I had never seen a spirit look so realistic or so solid before. There is also a less frightening experience I had in a local tattoo studio. This building was once a bank some years ago, and the building is over 100 years old. There was some other business in it prior to the studio moving there, but I don't recall what it was. One day while getting a tattoo myself, I was talking to the tattoo artist when I heard a female voice, except there were no other females there at the time. I also felt a decidedly feminine energy, and I asked the tattooist if the building had a spirit in it, and if it was a female. He confirmed to both questions, and next I felt someone brush the top of my head as I was having my tattoo done. I thought my 9-year-old son had touched my head, as he was there waiting for me to take him out to the playground, instead of spending several hours watching me get a tattoo. Turns out no one had touched me. That's when I knew it had to have been the female spirit. These were not the first times I have been touched by a spirit, or heard one or saw one. Until 1997, I had no idea a spirit had the ability to physically touch someone, until it happened to me. I love going to old places with history. You just have to be careful sometimes. You never know when a spirit might decide to follow you home. This happened around 6 months ago. So a little backstory. The way my backyard is, it leads to my garage. My backyard is more of a deck. Anyway, a few weeks prior to this creepy guy, there were a lot of cops in my area. This is a low crime rate town. Nothing big ever happens here. Maybe a stabbing every 3 years or a shooting every 5. And the cops were looking for this creepy guy. So one night I'm home alone. I'm playing some video games in the basement when I hear a loud bang outside near my garage. So I go upstairs to investigate. I look outside and my garage light is on. I think it's my girlfriend just getting home from work, so I'm standing there for about 5 minutes waiting for her to come through the garage door. Nothing. So I call my girlfriend and ask her if she's home. She tells me she won't be home for an hour. I'm in shock now, because I didn't leave that light on. I ended up calling the police. They came by and checked the garage. They told me someone was in there because everything was thrown about, and the cop that came said he would sit outside my house until my girlfriend got home. My girlfriend arrives and the cop bids me goodbye. I thought maybe it was just some kids. So my girlfriend then goes up to bed while I made some food. I ate, went out for a smoke, and get out my light when I looked towards my gate. That's when I heard a noise at my side gate. I look over, and there's some mid-40s guy just staring at me. "What are you doing?" I ask. I think I was in shock. He tries to open my gate. I threw my smoke at him and ran into the house and locked the door. I called the cops and told them what happened, and they came by again 5 minutes later. They told me no one was around, but believed he was there because the gate was wide open. I haven't seen him since, but this sure scared me. Growing up, we moved every year. I can say that in my life I have lived in at least 20 homes. Only one of them I actually experienced anything in. This would have been in 5th grade, so I was probably around 10, and I had 2 younger brothers who were around 4 and 6, and my parents. The house was just a simple 1-story in a normal neighborhood built in the 70s. This was 1999, so none of the houses were terribly old, some even renovated. It was a hit-and-miss middle-class family neighborhood. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. My parents both worked during the day, so since my brothers didn't yet go to school full-time, My grandma, who also lived in the neighborhood, would take care of them during the day, and I went home after school. As I was the last one to leave in the morning, I knew to turn everything off and lock up before I went to school. One day, I came home to find the shower was running. I thought it was weird, but didn't dwell on it much further, as I wanted to drop my stuff off and get back outside. Then it happened again for the next few days. I went around and checked all of the doors and windows, but everything was locked. I told my mum about it, but she kind of brushed it off. I would find out later that she brushed it off because she didn't want anything involved in the paranormal about the house. A little bit later, I was laying in bed starting to fall asleep when I felt something crawling on me. It felt like a light-footed cat over my sheets. I was too afraid to look, so I just lay there while this thing crawled across my bed, on and off of me. I never did look at it. This being an older house, the registers were on the floor, and I didn't sleep with a window open or a fan on, so it wasn't wind blowing my blanket around. One thing I've never been able to figure out is how my little brother's Mickey Mouse toy would work with no batteries. I mean, it's not like we took them out and it would work for an hour. This thing had no batteries for months and continued to function fully. This same little brother was also caught by my mum multiple times talking to himself in his room. When my mum would ask him who he was talking to, he would simply reply with, "The old man." Whatever. Kids have imaginary friends. But one night I heard hissing. I got up and looked out my door to see my little brother hissing like a cat at the top of the fridge. I went and got my mum, who rushed out of bed and kept telling him to stop. She started crying, and my dad rushed into the kitchen and finally started shaking him. He would not break his eyes from the top of the fridge. Finally, my dad literally shook him out of it, and he looked at my dad with the biggest smile and said something along the lines of, "He's gone now," and started laughing. We only lived in that house for a few more months after that. But the one other incident I will bring up is when my family went out to dinner and run errands one night. I was eating at a friend's house and didn't want to go, so I went home after dinner around 8, as they still weren't home. It was dark out by now, so I went inside and turned on the TV. I was sitting there for a while when I thought I heard whispering. I couldn't make out what it was, but didn't care. I just wanted to ignore it so it would go away. It came to a point in lull in between the TV, where the show ends and before the commercial begins, and I heard it clearly. "Hey." It was so close to my right ear that it could have been a person. I felt the breath on the side of my face. I booked it out the door and sat outside until my parents got home. Not wanting to scare anyone, I told them I was outside watching the fireflies, and I got yelled at for leaving the TV and lights on while being outside. Again, 20 plus homes and only one with paranormal activity. There were always little things that would happen. Lights would turn on and off, some light voices, and shadows coming from the corner of your eye. It certainly creeped me out, and I'm glad that we no longer reside there. This happened in early 2017. I was a 23-year-old girl and had just finished college. The field I studied was not huge in my area, so I knew I had to leave it, and I moved to the biggest city in my country in order to pursue a post-grad course and look for a job. As I was still unemployed, I thought I would wait to make a long-term rental contract, worrying about a bad commute to work. In the first few months, I was switching between Airbnbs and hostels all the time. I was tired of this and decided this would be my last move, and then, with or without a job, I would settle. I was already running out of money and decided to stay in a dorm in a hostel next to where I was taking classes. Sharing a bedroom is not a problem with me during a trip, but when you're living somewhere trying to create a routine and have some privacy, sharing a bathroom with complete strangers just sucks. I would share the dorm with 3 guys, but it's not with any of them my bad encounter was. They were nice, apart from them snoring badly at night. In another dorm, however, was the creepiest person I'd ever met. He was in his mid-30s and not traveling. He was a native from the city we were in and was using the hostel as a new house since his parents kicked him out of theirs. He introduced himself and tried to be nice and flirty. I was polite, but declined his interest. He wouldn't stop. He started following me all day long inside the hostel. Anywhere I went, he would show up in less than 5 minutes. On my second day there, I left the hostel to a job interview, and by the time I arrived late into the night, he was sitting alone in the front stair waiting for me. He told me I was the most beautiful thing on earth, and that he would buy me snacks, ask me out, and try to get information about my personal life. All the while, I had made it very clear that I wasn't interested. This happened in 3 days. I was already exhausted of his presence, but what I didn't know is that it would get worse. As soon as one of the guys that was sharing the dorm with me left, he asked hostel staff to switch dorms and stay in the same as me. Obviously, he never told me, so imagine how surprised and disgusted I was when I saw him coming to the dorm with all his belongings. I was so afraid of his presence that I kept sleeping with jeans on to avoid any sort of terrible situation. The very next morning, I knew I had to go. The situation had exponentially gone worse, and I couldn't handle it anymore. While I was packing, this guy showed up, noticed what I was doing and started to cry, asking me not to leave him. Then, to make things more creepy and disgusting, he told me he would miss seeing my face when I was asleep, and that he would have to take photos. I was trying my best to be chill about this, but I lost it when he told me he had taken pictures of me sleeping. I took his phone out of his hand and asked to see the pictures and delete them all. There was a bunch of me sleeping in the night before, and I left the hostel and really regretted not reporting him to the staff. I hope to never meet this creep again. Back around 2011, I had a girlfriend, who is now my ex, who really wanted to experience something paranormal. Myself and my family had experiences, as did hers. So now she was stoked about seeing something too. She decided that she wanted to do a really stereotypical thing. Let's go to a graveyard in the early hours of the morning and see if we can catch something on film or audio in a picture. I was against this, because at the time we were living with my father, who was in ill health. I'd always heard it was possible for things to follow you home, so I didn't want to do anything that could make his health worse. However, she was the kind of person that couldn't be talked out of something after making up her mind. Knowing how dangerous an area like this can be in the early hours, I ultimately went with her, as there are a lot of drunks leaving pubs and walking through this area. We spent the better part of 3.5 hours wandering around the graveyard before we found absolutely nothing. So we decided to go back home and spent a few hours watching TV before falling asleep. As we went to bed extremely late into the morning, we didn't wake up until around 11:30. We sat and spoke about the night before, how it was a shame that nothing happened, and then moved on to talk about our family's experiences. During this time, I started getting dressed. I put on my clothes and was sat on the bottom corner of my bed putting my shoes on. when as we were talking, we heard a familiar crack as the door opened. My girlfriend's face lit up with a shocked expression as she was not dressed. In one single impressive movement, she jumped up and pulled the duvet from underneath her and covered herself with it. I looked over towards the door, puzzled, as we were the only people in the house that could get upstairs, as my dad had extremely bad legs covered in large, deep wounds that would not heal. The handle came down and stayed down as the door slowly opened. After about 4 seconds, the door had opened about 3/4 before the handle slowly came back up, halfway before snapping back, as if someone had let go of it. Slowly it opened all the way, and I could see there was nobody on the other side. At this point, I had a huge grin on my face, partially from shock as I realized something else wasn't right. There was no noise leading up to this. The house is old. The floorboards and staircase are both completely shot, and if someone was heading towards the room, we would hear them without a doubt. Looking at me, she asked, "Who's there?" All I could say was, "No one." Eventually, I did leave the room to check the house. It was just the 3 of us. No one else was there, and my dad, of course, hadn't moved from downstairs. Around half an hour of this went by, and I went to our local shop to pick up a few bits. I brought 2 Rustler burgers as a quick breakfast for us before we went out. My ex stood talking to me in the kitchen as she watched me place the burgers in the microwave, with each on a separate small plate side by side, taking up almost all the room on the base of the microwave. After a minute or so, I looked through the door and saw something I wasn't expecting. The plates that I put in side by side were now stacked on top of each other, right in the middle. I didn't say a word. Blank-faced, I pulled out both plates, as they were, and looked at my girlfriend. Her jaw dropped. "I know you didn't put them in like that, I saw you," she said. After this, doors would begin to open without anyone being on the other side. This became a common occurrence for 6 months, and pretty much became a normal part of everyday life. I remember it happening when my friend was there. We sat playing FIFA on the Xbox, when suddenly we heard a crack. My friend looked around and said, "Your door just opened," to which I replied, "Yeah, it does that." When I was in middle school, I convinced my parents that for summer vacation we should go to a haunted hotel. So we went to the Menga Hotel in San Antonio. Well, for the first visit, I videotaped walking through the hotel with my dad and best friend. I didn't catch anything except a loud bang while we were rounding a corner, a girl whimper, and someone say, "You get down." Since then, I can't find the video, but while we walked through there, dead silence like you wouldn't expect walking through hotel hallways. Me and my best friend also ran up and down the halls late at night and heard people running above us on the 3rd floor. Excited, we ran up to see who was there, and there was no one. A security guard had actually come around the 2nd time, and we met this really chilled out lady taking photos, and she covered for us. But the lady and I got into a really interesting conversation, and she told us that her daughter and herself were mediums, and that every night at the foot of her and her husband's bed, there was a little boy standing there. She was really sweet, and told her about what we had been experiencing, and never saw her on the trip again. Finally, we came back home, and I entered my room to see one of my frames on the wall fell and shattered. The next morning I woke up, but I felt a hand at the foot of my bed. It was hard enough to wake me, and I knew I felt it by my feet. I remember once I woke up right before 10 and asked if it wouldn't wake me up. It never did after that. I thought I might be going a little crazy, but my dog was sleeping with me on the bed one night and jolted awake with me the following morning. It was never creepy because that was the extent of the paranormal I would say followed me home. It went away after I complained about it to my friend over the phone. After my parents divorced back in 2006, my mum could no longer afford to pay the mortgage on the house which we were living in, so we were forced to move. I was an angry child at the time, angry that we had to move out of this house. I loved that house. My mum and sister fell in love with the house that was across the street from a cemetery. I was terrified of cemeteries at the time, so living across from one was something out of my worst nightmares. We did, however, end up moving in. My mum, my sister, our 2 dogs and our 1 cat. Things were quiet for several weeks while living there, and it wasn't until 6 months later that unexplainable happenings began to occur. 6 months in, I woke up to a loud crash and looked over to the side of my bed. My Labrador was lying on the floor having a massive seizure. He never had had a seizure before, so this was terrifying. He had at least 3 in a row, and that day he was diagnosed with epilepsy. We'd had him for 5 years, and he had never once had a seizure before, so it was odd that he'd have one now. My sister adopted 2 kittens, and we had a cat tree that they would sleep on. It sat next to the recliner where I'd sit most of the time, so I could use it as my laptop. One day, I was sitting there in the recliner, and her cat, Tigger, was fast asleep on his tree. The house was completely silent, and then suddenly, Tigger shot off the tree like someone had come up from behind him and screamed as loudly as they could. It kind of reminded me of a scene from Ghost, when Patrick Swayze's character screamed into his cat's face to attack his murderer that was in his house. That cat was freaked out for the rest of the day and stayed up in my sister's room for the remainder of that day. The family cat, Addix, who never had had a sick day in her life, suddenly had 2 massive strokes the same night, within 30 minutes of each other, and died in my mum's arms a year after moving in. It wasn't just the animals that were affected though. Whatever lived there came after me. At 3:03 a.m. every night, my dog and I would be in a deep sleep, and at the bottom of the steps, it would sound like my mum stood at the bottom shouting, "Nick!" and it would wake both of us up. The first couple of times I would go see if my mum would be okay, and she'd be fast asleep. After that, I got into the habit of sleeping with my headphones on, so I didn't have to hear it. But even then, I'd still sometimes wake up to my name being shouted. Things would go missing in my house, not just anyone's things, but mine. I remember clearly that one night I had put my iPod on its charger before I went to bed. When I woke up the next day, my iPod was gone. It was nowhere to be found, and I searched everywhere for it. I gave up trying to find it after about a week, because there was nowhere else to look. Then about a month after it disappeared, I woke up, and the iPod was back on its charger like nothing had happened. I was working a job where I was closing the store almost nightly, so by the time I got home, I would be the only one awake, so I would sit in my living room with my laptop writing, when I would hear a whisper coming from the vents from the basement. It was a full conversation, and one time the whispers got louder, and so I took off upstairs with my dog. This was constant until I moved out at 24, and I took my dog with me. The minute we moved out, his seizures stopped. He was a completely different dog. My stuff stopped going missing, and the whispers also stopped. It's been nearly 6 years since I've lived in that house. I was the only one who believed the house was haunted, and I do bring it up with other people. My mum, my sister, but they still insist that there's nothing wrong. Whatever was living there, I was a target, and so were the animals, and I never want to go back, and I'll never have to, because the house has been sold. I do wonder though, if the current owners experience anything like I did. To take things back to the beginning, at the time of this, I was 14. I was a competitive dancer, and with that came a lot of traveling and a lot of stays in hotels. On this particular trip, we were going to Fargo, North Dakota. We would be there for 5 days, so we needed to find a reasonably priced hotel, but was also obviously safe. Me, my mum, my best friend Beth, and Beth's mum were going to carpool the 4 hours to Fargo and stay in the same hotel room. We made the 4-hour drive and pulled up to our days inn we had booked. Everything went as normal. My mum and Beth's mum checked in while Beth and I sat in the locked car. Once our mums came back with our room keys, we got our suitcases and made our way up to our room. We were on the 2nd floor, and being in the city for a dance competition, we had tons of luggage. To our disadvantage, there was no elevator in the hotel, only a tiny flight of winding stairs. Let me just explain the layout of this hotel. When we walked into the hotel doors, the check-in desk was to our right, and 2 couches sitting opposite each other were on the left. Straight in front of the entrance doors was the door to the pool, going past the check-in desk. You could turn left or right to get to the main floor hotel rooms. At the end of each hallway to your left was the staircase I mentioned earlier. Getting back to the story, we walked into the hotel and took a right at the check-in desk, and we were going to the end of the hall and up the stairs, our luggage clunking behind us. Once we made it up the stairs, our hotel room was halfway down the hall to the left. We approached our room, and as Beth's mum tried to use our keycard to open the wood door, the light on the door that would usually turn green, saying we could enter, turned red, meaning that our car was not activated properly. So Beth's mum went back to the front desk to get a new card. Me, my mum, and Beth waited outside our room joking and laughing about how our trip was off to such a great start, when a shorter, skinny, balding man approached us. He looked to be in his late 20s to early 30s. He approached us and said to my mum, "Where did you get your tattoos?" My mum at the time only had a couple of smaller, less noticeable ones, so you'd really have to be staring at her in order to see them. My mum goes, "Just a friend who does them back home." He then told us all that if we were interested, we could go into his room, and he motioned to it, and said that he can give us all some new ink. Obviously, we politely declined, and my mum told the man that we were only 14. He mumbled to himself and went back to his room. Just as he entered his room, Beth's mum came back and asked who that guy was. We explained the conversation, and then totally forgot as we entered our room. Later that day, we decided to go out and eat at a small restaurant that was a 10-minute drive from our hotel. I was the first one to exit the room, and at the end of the hallway across from the stairs was the same man sitting on the windowsill looking outside. I kind of gave my mum the look, you know, The look when you don't want to draw attention to yourself by directly pointing or saying, "Look over there." She casually looked, and we gathered up enough courage to walk down the hall towards the stairs. As we approached him, I came upon the shocking realization that he was giggling to himself and carving something into the window with a knife. I let out a small gasp as he turns to me and gently stroked the blade. Me, Beth, and our mums booked it down the stairs and ran to the front desk to alert the guy who was working there. He didn't seem to care, but he told us he would look into the matter. Mine and Beth's mum stood at the desk talking to the man, while I asked Beth's mum for the keys so that Beth and I could sit in there safely. She unlocked the doors to the vehicle, and I called Beth to follow me. She was texting her boyfriend and told me to just wait up for her. Our mums had just finished talking to the guy, so we were all standing in the doorway waiting for Beth, when I turn around and noticed the man standing directly behind Beth. I grabbed her arm and told her that we needed to go. She kept resisting and saying she needed to respond to her boyfriend before we left because she wouldn't have Wi-Fi at the restaurant. Finally, I screamed at her to get off her phone and we sprinted to the car and got in. We made the drive to the restaurant and Beth and I were hysterical. Once we got there, we called the hotel to tell them we weren't staying there and we wanted a refund. The manager was reluctant and asked us to come back so we could talk about the situation. I don't know why, but we went back, gathered all of our belongings as fast as we could, throwing whatever we could fit in whichever bag was closest. Beth's mum was so freaked out she was throwing up heavily in the bathroom. I don't know when the police were called, but as we exited our room, the man's door was open a crack and an older woman sat there. I think she was trying to calm down the creepy man. I peeked in and saw 3 big trash bags under his bed and weapons sitting on the little table across from it. Again, being the idiot that I am, I gasped and the 2 people in the room turned around. We quickly ran downstairs with all of our stuff and went to a new hotel, and a very expensive one at that. The front desk worker at Days Inn was just a part-time guy, and his shift had just started. He'd got thrown into the situation and ended up being the one we spoke to about our refund, since we hadn't even stayed the night there. He gave us our money back and said something along the lines of, "This should never happen, and I know my boss won't want me to refund your stay, but this is unacceptable, and if they want to fire me for helping you guys out, so be it." God bless that guy, and I hope he knows what a godsend he was at that moment. Honestly, I'm glad we got out of there when we did, because I don't want to know what his intentions were when he got us into his room, and it haunts me every day, not knowing what was in those 3 garbage bags under his bed. I'm just happy that we all made it out alive. Christmas Day, mid-90s. I was about 6 years old. The house we lived in had a conservatory, which we used for family dinners. That Christmas, there was my parents and grandmother present. I was pretty young, so basically remember nothing else from that day apart from the event that followed up, both of which are crystal clear in my memory. Dinner's ready, the TV gets turned off, and we all head to the dining table to start eating. Then we hear a deep gargling sound coming from the adjoining lounge. It sounds like a mix of choking, gargling water in the throat, and the way a singer sounds when a song is reversed. It was pretty disturbing. Everything goes silent. We all freeze and glance at each other, then start to try and locate the source of such a noise. We look around basically as the whole house is eliminating everything we could possibly think of as a potential source. As far as I remember, we eventually shrugged off the event and carried on with the day as normal. Now, the follow-up was sometime later. It was probably springtime. My dad likes his gardening, and about 3/4 of the garden were pristine. The very bottom, however, was my patch, and I could do whatever I wanted down there. I dug a hole, a big hole, that was perhaps 2 feet deep. I say a 12-foot wide hole when I found a set of top front teeth, which appeared to be set into pinkish stone. They were definitely for a human, and we didn't really investigate this much, as it was more curious. This wasn't the only incident at that house that was odd. Many years later, we found out that about 60 years prior, there was a stream at the bottom of the garden. While I've always had a keen sense of skepticism, my mother was convinced that the house was haunted, and later that the spirits had followed us to our new house. We had a few instances of banging and scratching from the attic, although in hindsight I'm pretty sure that was something to do with the heating system. The oddest experience was not necessarily that scary, but I was running up a really high fever one night. I was in bed and hallucinating all kinds of stuff, massive spiders crawling up into bed with me and things like that. My room was painted, but had a wallpaper border near the ceiling, and one of my hallucinations was of my uncle, an avid biker, riding along it. I started shouting his name at the top of my voice and getting really upset, and he died in a motorbike accident about a month later. We were staying in a historic home in the old girls' wing in room number 6. I was around 11 and had not been told this house was haunted. There was only one other family staying in the whole house, as it was huge, and they were on a totally opposite wing on the ground floor. There were stairs on the floor above us in the main house, and at around 11 p.m. someone started running up and down them over and over. Everyone was asleep, and exactly at midnight, I heard a little girl speak. It sounded like she was in the room with us, but I have no idea what the voice was saying, but she repeated a phrase 3 times. Being scared to death, I called my mum and she immediately woke up and heard the voice too. Then my brother and I woke up, and he and I both heard a chair in the room squeaking, like someone was bouncing up and down on it. Also in the middle of the night, my brother woke up on the floor, as if someone had pushed him from the bed. I found out later the family of the house had a young daughter who died tragically, and to this day, I still cannot sleep in old homes.